Ready?
Should be good.
All right, thank you, Summer. I'm going to call the regular Moab City Council meeting to order at 6:06 p.m. And just before we do the roll call attendance, I just want everybody to know that our next regular council meeting will be in person on April 12th. And we also have a special meeting coming up on March 31st, and that will also be in person. So, Summer, roll call.
I'm not multitasking well, I apologize.
That's okay.
I have Mayor Joette Langanese, Ronnie Dressery, Moab City Council, Ben Billingsley, Acting Deputy City Manager and Finance Director, Carly Castle, Acting City Manager, Jason Taylor, Moab City Council, Caitlin Jones, Moab City Council, Luke Wojciechowski, Moab City Council, Ronnie Dressery, Moab City Council, and Tony Knutson Boyd, Moab City Council.
Great, thank you. Citizens be heard. Anybody out there? Citizens to be heard, or anybody for the public hearing?
I do not have anyone in the waiting room yet. I do have Sarah ready for her presentation, but that's all in the waiting room right now. We did receive one comment about the salaries, and we did receive one comment, citizens to be heard, about the Arches Drive situation.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll start off with our public hearing. So I'm going to open the public hearing. We have two. The first one is proposed ordinance 2022-03, an ordinance adopting the City of Moab pay plan schedule and adopting the exempt and elected official salaries for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. And I'm also going to open the public hearing for proposed ordinance 2022-06, an ordinance amending Title III of the Moab Municipal Code to update Chapter 3.50 Master Fee Schedule and modifying certain fees and rates charged by the city. So, since there's nobody out there, I think I'm going to go ahead and leave the public hearing open until we get to the point where we vote. I just don't want, in case somebody comes in late, I don't know how, do you have a suggestion, Summer, on how best to handle that?
I don't, but I can certainly watch the waiting room and just give you a heads up if somebody pops in. Maybe if we get close to that item,
Okay.
if we have somebody waiting, I'll let you know.
All right, so that's what we'll do. We'll leave them open, and then I'll close the public hearing when we get to the point in the agenda under new business, just in the event that somebody comes in and wants to talk to us about those two items. And then, yes, Ronnie.
Oh, I'm just going to apologize for the noise at the beginning. I didn't know my speaker was on. I was trying to give my dog dinner, and I occasionally have to be the human dog door. So when I get up, I'm not going to Mexico. I'll be right back. I just have to open the door.
We thought you were preparing dinner for all of us. All right, Sarah Melankoff is up with our first presentation. We have two, one on Moab Solutions and then one on Lions Park River. Both will be pretty brief. But Sarah is here to give us a little video on all the good work that she's been doing out there. And I'm waiting for her to connect to audio. And then I think, Ben, you're gonna assist her with her presentation for us. But let's give her a minute to come online. Sarah was on. Do you know where she went?
It looks like she lost connection. She's in the waiting room again. Do you want me to bring Annie in also so she's teed up? Okay.
Yep, that'd be great.
Okay.
Sarah, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oops. She was with us.
Not sure what happened.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move to Annie's presentation, and then we'll get Sarah on and we'll go from there. So Annie, why don't you let us know what's going on with Lions Park? And I know that you don't have much to say, but I think it was good for for the council to know that what you're working on.
Yeah, so it's more of an update than a presentation, and we were hoping to have a few more materials for you tonight. We wanted you guys to be aware of a planning process that has recently been initiated. So the county has begun a planning process that is being facilitated by the National Park Service Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. And this is to improve the boat ramp off of Highway 191 that's being referred to as Town Ramp. So the main planning effort focuses on the county side, on the access and the boat ramp, on the parking on the north side of the river. But the discussions have included possibilities for the Lions Side Park. And so there is a big desire for formalized pedestrian access to the river from Lions Park. And so while we know that there are many, we need many more discussions on capacity and management considerations that won't be a part of the county's planning efforts. But at this point, we have indicated that we are open to the idea, keeping it pedestrian based and not a boat ramp. So the concept plans will be ready to share in April, but I'm open right now to any initial reactions that you might have, and then we'll keep everyone updated on how to participate.
Questions for Annie? I think we're going to get a bigger presentation in April sometime, Annie, is that correct?
Yeah, so I think the first step would be to invite you to the county's open house on the issue, and then as the discussions start to evolve. But we didn't want you to see concept maps and ideas out there without you being aware.
Right. Ronnie?
It sounds like it's pretty preliminary at this stage. I mean, do we have any sense at this point if we're talking about boat ramps, and I mean, how big or small this access would be?
Yeah, right now it's for the county side. They're really just looking to improve what has become congested and deteriorated. Just from the preliminary discussions we've had, we are thinking still very pedestrian. So you might be able to carry a kayak or a sup, but there's going to be no boat ramp, no trailers, no vehicles.
Thanks.
Anybody else? All right, Annie, looking forward to the discussion in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. See you.
Sarah, are you out there? I think you're muted. So if you could unmute. Sarah, are you there? Well, I'm not sure what to do with Sarah at this point. Perhaps we can, I'm wondering if we want to postpone this presentation until our meeting in April when we can do it in person, and then we don't have to worry about this technology complication. Wonder. Yeah, Ronnie?
Oh, is there any value like leaving the public hearing open to kind of, give it 10 or 15 minutes in case Sarah can, figure out how to fix whatever's going on?
Yeah, the public hearing is still open.
Oh, yeah, no. I just didn't know if Sarah's experiencing a hitch she might fix in the next 5 minutes or, yeah.
Yeah, we could, I'm thinking, why don't, Summer, why don't you reach out to Sarah and see if she'd be willing to come to our meeting in April and do an in-person presentation.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I see her mute, Sarah. Are you
Oh,
There she is.
I am so sorry. I
That's
am
okay.
even more like than I thought. Every time I tried to move this thing, it just disconnected me.
Well, don't touch it.
I know, so I can't, good, I can't see myself then. I am very sorry and I appreciate your patience.
Sure.
I guess I'm more low tech than I even thought I was. Sad.
Zoom is clunky, Sarah. It's okay. We're all struggling through it.
Okay. So first of all, I wanted to welcome all the new people, Joette and the other council people, and say hi to the old folks. A warm welcome. And I especially thank Ben. As he can tell, I'm not capable. He is going to help me with something when I queue him up. So quite a while ago, we got word there was a homeless camp under the river bridge. So I had occasion to go there to clean it up. It was a pretty big mess. During that time, I saw the trash recycling system at Lions Park, and I was a little sad by that. So I went back and I started going, there's 11 trash cans, 2 recycle bins. So I started going every day for about 11 days, removing just from the trash cans, the recycling. So there's a very short video of that. If Ben would queue up the number 1. It's 1 minute, 36 seconds. But if you can mute it, because I don't really like the music. You guys might dig it, I don't know.
So while we're waiting for the queue up, go ahead, Ben. Do you have a question?
Nope, I was just letting you know that I was still getting it pulled up. I
Okay.
have it open, but then you click share and okay,
go.
can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
I'm not sure if Sarah can see it, but it is playing, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I can see it. Part of it. It goes all the way to City Hall. No. Oops, that's not right. The movie didn't end, Ben. The movie had a couple more seconds. Okay, that's it. There's
Okay.
going to be another. There's going to be another.
Oh my goodness, are you serious? Look at all that.
I am so serious.
Holy smokes. Wow.
So the issue is that was 11 days during a very quiet time of the month of the year. So Ben, can you leave that off? So then here's the issue I have. I have a very addictive personality. I'm addicted to not seeing waste. So of course I couldn't stop going to Lions Park because it was so upsetting to me to realize how many things were being thrown out. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what's happening community-wide. So I kept going. And then number 2, if Ben wants to put up, that's from 2 days.
Okay, just pulling that up.
That's 2 days. I mean, the environmental cost of aluminum on the planet is ungodly. Anyway, that's what I got in a couple days. So of course I still couldn't stop going, which is horrible. If you could put up number 3, it's the infographic. And I will talk over that because there's a really happy, semi-happy ending to this whole thing. So before I was going to show this to you, I thought, let me reach out to Mark Matson, the parks #1 guy under Annie. And because I met him once and he seemed interested in street level things. So I asked him, could we meet over at Lions Park? I wanted to share what I had found with him. So we met over there and he had been wanting to reach out to me to talk about how to improve recycling over there. So I was like, wow, I have waited 17 years for this because I've made the offer to the city for decades. We could show you how to do it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Mark said the half marathon was ending at Lions Park that weekend. So I decided to ask him, is it okay if we install recycle bins there that would go to our source separated gem of a recycle center, a community recycle center? He was all for it. And so a partnership formed in 5 minutes between Canyonland Solid Waste Authority, who prepped and cleaned 10 bins for us, the city that picked them up on the trailer, and Moab Solutions, who went over. With some help, a big shout out to Dave Mahone and Robbie Woods for helping to place them. And so they were there all weekend. I went back on Sunday to get them, and there were so many people in the park. I said to the city guy, I can't take them out. There's too many people here. I want them to have the opportunity to recycle. So we left them in. We were going to get them Monday, and then I had an idea. I asked Mark, is it okay if we leave those there as an experiment? As long as I have the energy and the strength, I'll go and service them, and I'll take everything to our source separated center. So he said, yeah. So I'm like super thrilled that we were able to form a really nice partnership quickly, give people an opportunity to recycle over wasting, make sure the recycling was best practices where it goes to a source separated center where it's sold and it's treated like the precious resource it is, not like a pile of garbage. And so if this works, and if you guys have the political will to try to make this kind of recycling work in all the parks, it's really not as hard as one might think it is. And I'm very happy to help assess things and explain what might work. When Evan Tyrrell gets back from a conference, he and I were going to meet with Mark and discuss how can we maximize recycling and minimize wasting. And when you do that, things even out, or you're even on the plus side as far as what you're spending on landfilling. So that was the happy ending to that movie. There wasn't going to be one until I thought to call Mark. So that's my story.
That's a good story. Thanks, Sarah.
And then Joette, I know that I was very naughty getting here late and kept disconnecting and all, but can I do a real quick rundown of a couple other things?
Sure.
Okay. So we run the Emergency Needs Fund. I'm on call 24/7 the last 10 years. A lot of the nighttime calls are from law enforcement and weekend calls. And just so you know, the community entrusts us with their money, and they know that we're going to use it only for emergency needs. So in 2020, we spent $67,870. That was a COVID special year where somebody decided to give us a lot of money to give cash to people that were not documented or living in the shadows. So we gave out 32,000 cash, working with churches, other nonprofits, law enforcement, et cetera. 2021, 39,513. This year to date, we spent $8,853 on emergency assistance, keeping people in housing, utilities, food, medicine, gasoline to get to work, et cetera. I guess that's all I have to say for now, except we continue working with the homeless on the Parkway. There's a few problematic people now. There's people I'm sure we're going to find dead pretty soon. It's very tragic. And hopefully in the future, we can work on the warming center, cooling center, crisis resource center. There might be some good news in that too. So thank you very much, and thanks for being patient with my ineptitude.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you for everything you do. We really appreciate it. Our community is lucky to have you out there.
Thank
So-
you, Joette. I
You're
appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I got to deviate from the agenda a little bit, Summer. There's somebody in the waiting room, Jake Bornstein. He's John Curtis's legislative assistant, and we really would like to bring him in quickly to say hello and introduce him to you all. So if you
Sure,
could-
and we lost Ronnie, so I'll bring her in also. Oh, he just popped off.
Oh. Okay.
I saw him and then I lost him.
Okay. Having a little bit of a disjointed meeting tonight. Sorry about
He's
that.
back.
Here's
We're
Jake.
back.
Great. Jake is the legislative director for Representative John Curtis. Ronnie and I have met with him on many occasions over the years pertaining to the UMTRA project. And so he's in town today. He came in late this afternoon, and Ronnie and I were unable to meet with him. So thrilled that he's able to join us just for a few minutes to say hello, introduce him to you. And if you have any questions for him, I'm sure he'll be open to answer any questions you have. So are you with us, Jake?
I don't see that he's connected to audio.
Okay, so maybe he's taken a few minutes. Representative Curtis's office, and particularly Jake, has been really, really instrumental in getting the funding for increase for the UMTRA project. And Ronnie, have we heard have we gotten any information? I'm sure Jake knows the answer to this on how much funding.
And
Jake.
this is Jake here. Can you hear me now?
We can, Jake. Welcome. This is
We-
Joette.
Oh gosh,
We
sorry
should
about all
have
the
Jake
technical
announce
difficulties.
that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm glad you could join us. So you know me, I'm Joette. I'm now the mayor of Moab, the city of Moab. And we have our 5 council members, Jason Taylor, Kaylin Jones, Luke Wojorowski. Sorry, Luke. I challenge you to say my last name too. You could probably say mine. Ronnie and Tawny. And we also have our staff, Bill Billingsley and Carly Castle. And Summer Johnson is our city recorder. So Jake, I understand this is your first visit here to our area. I hope you had a good day so far. And what's going on with Congress these days?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Is my video working now too?
Yeah,
Can you hear me
yep.
still?
Yep.
Well, I am doing everything I can for the local economy. I'm 2 cups of coffee deep at coffee shop. Moab coffee roaster. So I'm off to a great start here today. So appreciate you hosting me. So, and it's like correction. So I've been here a few times actually. And when I told my wife I was stopping by, all she had to say was she was jealous she couldn't join. And I am proud to say one of my most worn t-shirts is my Moab t-shirt. And everywhere I go, people always talk about how great this community is. So we think the world of what y'all are doing here. And so we just want to do what we can to support you on the federal level. So most recently, in Congress, we've been really busy. We're proud that as of last week with the passing of the new omnibus, Congressman's been working really hard to increase funding for the Moab UMTRA project. When he came into office, he really saw us as an issue of, we got to get this done and we got to get it cleaned up and offer that to the community for whatever the next purpose may be. And, when he came in, it was in, I think like 28 million or something. We got that increased into the high 30s, got the increase to about 45. Proud with the signing of the law last week. We got that funded at $67 million for this year.
Oh, my
Pretty
goodness.
dramatic increase.
Yeah.
So we're really looking forward to getting that project done as soon as we can. And you'll see the continued support from Congressman Curtis on that. Otherwise, the congressman, he's been on the new committee, Energy and Commerce, for about a year now. When he came to Congress, he knew that's where he wanted to be because all the issues important to Utah are represented there, from healthcare to telecom, energy, climate, environment, ozone, big tech. really broad jurisdiction. So if there's any, local concerns in any of those categories, never hesitate to let us know. And vice versa, when we see things that we think are particularly impacting those areas, you'll hear from us. So it's excited to be representing you on that front with this new committee. We just passed the most recent omnibus, so we're going to have to do another spending bill in about 6 months. There we go. Usually that goes another, until December, but we're staying busy in Washington, and the congressman's had 15 bills signed into law now since he came to office. We had another one signed last week related to having a national methamphetamine response strategy, and we've been really engaged in the opioid debate there and helping those in need on that front. So we're kind of all over the place, but happy to answer any questions, and just really appreciate you welcoming me to your great community.
Thanks, Jake. Anybody have questions for him? Great opportunity. So, Ronnie.
So Jake, I think people out here sometimes wonder, is it a good time to come to DC yet to talk to legislators, or given COVID and other things, still iffy if that's a good investment of time and money?
Great question. We'd obviously love to have you out there. We are allowed to start giving Capitol tours in about a week. So we're really excited about that. On the House side, we're allowed to bring groups of up to 15 into our office. So, our office, we're in the office during session. We'd love to see you. So definitely, short of, some sort of variant we can't predict, obviously, it's certainly I think especially starting a week, a good time to come visit. So yeah, we'd love to have you.
Great.
I guess just one other quick question. I know Representative Curtis is always good about coming to our area to do town halls. Do you guys have anything planned soon?
I will circle back with you. I know he tries to get down here every few months and just kind of do a straight line down through the rural parts. So if we don't have on the books, we will soon. So I'm happy to follow up with you.
That'd be great. It'd be great to have him down here. Love to have him here and hear what he has to say. So one thing that I would just like to bring to your attention, Jake, you may be aware of this, is Senator Lee is working on a bill called the Housing Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but at some point it'd be great to talk to the congressman about that bill and what that's all about and your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, happy to do that. Is that the one related to expanding the Recreation Public Purposes Act for affordable housing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. I know that it's in the beginning stages, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that and what we could do to support it if it's something that we feel would benefit our community. So.
Yeah, I don't know the nuances of the bill. I've heard them talk about it. Happy to bring to the congressman's attention to circle back with y'all too. I don't think there's a version in the House
No.
at this point. So if that's something that y'all are interested in supporting, please let us know. Because at the end of the day, we're here to serve you and your needs. I know I've heard y'all bring up affordable housing before, so anything we can do would be helpful on that front. We'd love to do. And the congressman especially understands the difficulty of having so much public land surrounding your community, and you're paying for all this infrastructure for tourism and all these other things needing to sustain a stable workforce. So anything we can do to make that easier, let us know. We're happy to support you.
Great, thanks. Ronnie.
I did have one other quick thing. We had a workshop before this meeting with the EPA about regional haze. And since you've just mentioned that the congressman is interested, on a committee where he's interested in working on things like ozone and, some of that work is touching on such things. Is that something we could also follow up with you guys about?
We would absolutely love that. So on Energy and Commerce, we have jurisdiction over the Clean Air Act. The EPA administrator comes to our committee at least every few months to testify. We have a really good working relationship with the EPA staff. So issue big or small in that category, I think EPA understands that air pollution is a complicated topic and areas are implicated differently. Up in Salt Lake with the inversions, it's just one example. Sure, you have unique issues down here. We'd love to be your go-between with EPA. So please do.
Thank you.
Very good. Great timing. Any other questions from council for Jake? Well, I hope you have a good rest of your visit planned while you're here. I'm glad that we could make some time to see you, and Ronnie and I will be in touch to talk to you about some of the things that we just asked you about. So have a great time, and we'll be seeing you and talking to you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you. Anything we can do, don't hesitate. And my boss being a mayor, there's no one he holds in higher esteem than local government. So anything we can do to make your life easier, please let us know. So thank you for your time.
Will do. Thanks, Jake. All right, that was good. I'm glad we got to be able to talk to him. I know that he kind of hijacked our agenda, but it was a good hijack. So good to have him here. So next on the agenda is the consent agenda. We have approval of the minutes from March 8th and approval of the bills against the city of Moab in the amount of $596,805.93. And do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Motion made by Tawny, second.
Second.
Seconded by Kalen. Any discussion, Tawny?
No.
Kalen?
No.
Anybody else? Ronnie?
Oh, I just sent a few things to Summer. Thank you, Summer.
Okay. All right. I'll call for the vote. Tawny?
Aye.
Kalen?
Aye.
Luke?
Aye.
Ronnie?
Aye.
Jason, sorry.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Next on the agenda, we have the draft landscaping requirements. And I think Mila is going to join us for this discussion. If you guys recall, back in February, we had the Water Now Alliance make a presentation to us about landscaping standards and some options for us to consider. And so now it's time for us to decide what we would like to do with these standards and how we want to move forward with it. And Mila, I'm going to just turn the time over to you to let the council know what your thoughts are and then have a discussion.
Great. Yeah, so essentially the purpose of this discussion item is to get direction from the council as far as what direction, how we want to move forward in developing these standards into code. So of course, this is just the first step in that process. So we would be taking your recommendations and then, proposing code amendments accordingly, which would then go through, they could either come back before council for another discussion or go to planning commission for public hearing and for to go through that part of the process. We did have this discussion with planning commission and the water board. Their opinions were generally summarized in the agenda summary. Both of those bodies were very conscious that the council is really the one that directs this decision. So that's why neither one of them have made any more formal recommendations. So if you wanted to, the other option is to make your recommendations and send it back to them for more details. But they did largely agree on their approach and on what they liked. So I'm happy to, answer any questions about how those discussions went or anything else. John Berggren from the Western Resource Advocates team was hopefully going to join us tonight to be able to answer your technical questions, but he has a young baby at home, and so it was a question what the status might be on that. So he might pop in, and if he doesn't, then I'm happy to pass those along to him. They really are the technical experts on these standards. So if you do have really detailed questions, then I'll punt those to them. But in the meantime, essentially the real decision before us is to either take the water budget approach plus some other standards, or a suite of standards with no water budget, or just a water budget. I slightly misremembered. We had actually had the staff recommendation. We had a few circular discussions during our meeting, and we had written down both options, and I put the wrong one in the packet. So just to clarify, the staff recommendation is actually that below 2,000 square feet, which is the amount that triggers a building permit, there would be no requirements and just strong encouragement and education. And then between 2,000 and 8,000 square feet, there would be hard requirements with the option to change those limits based on a water budget. And then above 8,000 square feet, there would be a water budget required. And staff did not feel, and I think Planning Commission as well, did not feel that commercial and residential needed to have different standards. The Water Board did feel that that was an important division to make. And we can talk about that further if you have questions.
So Mila, just for clarification purposes, my understanding is that these would only apply to new developments.
Yes.
They wouldn't apply to those of us that have been here for a while.
Correct. It would only apply. So the reason that we divided it up between those levels of square footage is that those are the levels that currently trigger different types of planning and building reviews. So anytime one of those was triggered, then was needed, any of those permits were needed, that's when these requirements would come into effect. So it could happen with redevelopment, but only with large redevelopment.
Okay.
And everything else, all of the knowledge and the the recommendations that are going into these standards are intended to be additionally developed as outreach materials for the community. So education, best practices, guidelines, things like that for people that are curious or would like to be able to take advantage of these kinds of things.
Questions for Mila and discussion, I guess, on how you guys want to move forward with this. Kaylin?
So thank you for all your work on this. It's nice to see this moving forward. And so let's see. I am generally supportive of staff's recommendations. Let's see. I'm in favor of having irrigation system criteria as well. I wasn't sure if that was included in staff recommendations, but it seems like getting that right at the time of installation is important, and it's not that much harder to do it right the first time. I'm wondering for the turf limits, if there should be additional language to explicitly accommodate public recreational uses, both as a way to engage schools and also so that the city isn't accused of having a double standard, as sometimes we are, just like parks can have lots of turf, but it's because they're a shared community resource, and it gets to be enjoyed by a lot of people, as opposed to just being the path of least resistance as a ground cover. And then I'm curious why the Water Conservation Board wanted to differentiate between residential and commercial. If you wouldn't mind expounding a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, my impression was that they were really concerned with not overburdening the sort of average Moab local who wanted to do a house, essentially. That was what kept coming up, was just like an individual, specifically, a local already, not somebody coming in to develop a house to make money on, a local who wanted to build a house is who they didn't want to inconvenience. Staff's way around that, I guess, in sort of accommodating that, was the recommendation that a building permit for less than 2,000 square feet not have any requirements. because that seems to be generally the category that the water board was referring to, was somebody who might be building a 2,000 square foot house, for instance.
So these square foot limits are based on the building size rather than the landscape size.
Correct.
So on a commercial property in C3 with 0 lot lines, they may have by the time they do parking in the building, they may have very little landscaping, but they would still be subject to this.
I mean, if it was over 2,000 square feet, yes, for the development, the building, I believe. I don't think that the square footage would include parking or anything like that.
Right, but what I'm saying is that post-development, there may be very little landscaping, so the investment in all these other things may be disproportionate relative to the amount of water used. So, but that was my misunderstanding. I thought it was based on the landscaped area because that was one of the criteria in the irrigation system criteria. So, okay, I'll have to think about that. Well, I agree that it should be based on just square footage of development or landscape, because if you're building a home, you also already have to comply with the building code, which is far more complex than the landscaping requirements. So my 2 cents.
Thanks. Anybody else? Ronnie?
So I listened in on the March 9th Water Advisory Board meeting, and I really like their suggestions. So the first and foremost thing was, apparently there's been kind of attempts at longstanding conversation about the importance of education and outreach before kind of adding regulations or ordinances about things. So I just wanted to make sure it was communicated. There was a lot of discussion about the desire for that before having an ordinance is education and outreach in the community, just because even though this won't necessarily apply to residents, if our larger goal is to reduce water, we kind of need a cultural shift in how we use water and how we landscape. So I'm throwing out that education and outreach piece. I wanted to re-listen to the meeting before this, but then things got a little haywire with other emails coming in. So I hopefully won't misrepresent anything here, but my sense is that there was more support for putting commercial things in place first, maybe holding off a little bit on the residential, but I may be remembering that wrong. But they spoke specifically about if you were going to pick things off the list, liking going with the water budget, because that seemed to provide a lot of flexibility for people. And then in combination with the water budget, the hydro zones and maintenance, because I think, as we all know, you could start with the nice landscape, but if it's not maintained, there goes the farm. And then there was some discussion about plant lists and just having a recommended plant list. So that all resonated with me. So I guess looking at the list, that's kind of what I was thinking. And I kind of thought the group should have a discussion about education and outreach, and just think about what we're trying to achieve and what should come first, whether it's cart before the horse, to pass something before we've had some engagement on that, or if you just want to roll it out together.
So Mila, do you want to respond?
Sure. So our idea, so, as far as staff capacity and time goes, maintenance can be a really tricky issue, obviously. And so our solution to that was, or idea, I guess it's not a solution, but it was an idea, is that if a person changes more than 50% of their landscape their, planned landscape, then that would sort of trigger a re-review. And so, essentially this would be complaint driven, just as all the rest of our code enforcement is. And so, it would not preclude somebody from, digging up like one bed and planting a tree instead or something along those lines. But, if they changed a whole half of their landscape, and a neighbor, really didn't notice it and didn't like it or whatever it was, then that's what would trigger a review. I think that, so we talked with, who was it? It's a community in Colorado. I'm not going to remember which one it is, but they are one of the example communities that we used in developing these standards. And they've had a really similar thing in place for a couple of years now. And I believe they said that they have one full-time person devoted to like going around town and doing the maintenance reviews for landscaping. So we thought that was probably a little far advanced at the moment, because it would just require so much staff time. And I'm not sure that it would also be particularly palatable, from a community standpoint, having somebody come driving around and, sort of checking up on your landscaping all the time. But so the idea was that potentially that review could be triggered with a 50% change, and that would be, a sort of, okay, we can respond to this complaint at that point. That's that one. And then the outreach and education, I'm not entirely certain if there's still some confusion about who this applies to, but this is only for new development. So there would be plenty of information available, via the code, et cetera, for anybody who is trying to develop. And the outreach and education is planned to go along with the code that's adopted for current people that would like to voluntarily do any of these kinds of updates to their yards. We're hoping that the plant list is part of the plan, and that would be developed regardless of any of these standards that are adopted or not adopted. That's just something that the planning department has been in need of for a while, and it's requested by a number of people. So that outreach and education is planned for current homeowners in conjunction with these standards that would be for new development only. So I'm not sure, I guess I'm saying I'm not entirely sure who the outreach and education would be aimed at prior to development standards only for new development. I guess it would be for people that were interested in developing. In which case it could be in the code or not, I suppose.
I would think you'd want education to be for everybody.
It is. Yeah. Yeah, the education piece is part of what we're planning. I just mean as far as the order, because I know there was some question about the water board was talking about outreach and education coming prior to adopting any standards.
Caleb?
In my mind, I'm okay with commercial properties becoming educated at the time they develop. Residential, and likewise for new residential development. I would think that the education would be geared towards encouraging existing landscape owners and maintainers to proactively and voluntarily improve the water efficiency of their landscapes. And then one possible side benefits is that, like, when other people get around to upgrading or changing their yard or remodeling, then they've been exposed to this media perhaps over a period of years, and so it's not a surprise when they get more details.
Right. Ronnie?
I just have a question for the group about gravel. I mean, I understand landscaping in our code definition is always allowed, like the alternative to plant cover to be, you could just put gravel out. But I don't know about you guys, but I notice a lot of new condos, which probably are expensive enough, they're only going to outsiders, and second homes where people sometimes strip out perfectly good vegetation and replace it with gravel. And I know, Mila, at the water board, you kind of mentioned, on the one hand, you have some of the advantages of, if you have the vegetation, of shade and combating, the heat islands or whatever. But at the same time, I mean, I think people like the flexibility of that. On a sustainability standpoint, I remain confused about it in terms of, I don't know, amassing all of that gravel and what it takes to get it. But then also, I don't know how many of you have done landscaping maintenance, but the amount of physical labor it takes to clean weed growth out of gravel is significant. So I've been watching a lot of residents this past week, like spraying pesticides on weeds growing in gravel. And I didn't know if there's any, when one is doing something like this, do you try and proactively think about whether you're doing things that might increase the use of chemicals on landscapes, or is that really a separate thing?
I can go ahead and answer that really briefly. Yeah. So the ground cover question is complicated. I think, there's a lot of people that advocate strongly, I think, in all three directions, which are vegetation, mulch, and gravel, or, rocks of some kind. I think there's arguments for all three. You're totally right that the heat island effect and shade and water retention in the soil and infiltration is all much better with vegetation. But of course that does, require some water to maintain it. So, there's a little bit of a trade-off there. I certainly don't have the data or the numbers to say, exactly what the trade-off is, with a patch of yard that's gravel and a patch of yard that, is water-wise vegetation, for instance. I think some of that is on the homeowner and what they want to maintain. We've had a lot of conversations about mulch versus gravel. Again, mulch does have an advantage in that it keeps water also, or at least partially, much more so than gravel anyway. And it can also help, develop the soil. It provides some habitat for microbes and things like that. So, it's living essentially rather than rocks. But, then again, it can also be hard to maintain. There were some concerns about our floods and storm drains, because mulch is much more likely to float away than gravel would be. So, I think that would need to have some restrictions as far as where something like mulch could be applied. So, I think, and then of course, gravel is a good way to at least help try to keep the dust down. I think that nobody really wants there to just be kind of bladed bare ground, because that can end up with a lot of erosion. And, we have dust problems in the county in general. So, yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I hear you for sure. There are ways to put down some pretty good weed barriers underneath gravel. That can help a lot, but those deteriorate over time as well. And I think it's all trade-offs.
Anybody else? Suggestions, or Luke?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Mila said and kind of give voice to some of the opinions shared during the Planning Commission. And one of them was regarding gravel and like non-permeable membranes, and the erosion and removing the amount of dust in the air was specifically cited as one of those things to look out for. I think there's also just kind of a general consensus of leaving some of those options open to the residents. It seemed to kind of universally, the Planning Commission seemed a little bit uneasy about any sort of requirements for residents, just to give people a little bit more say in how they want their home to look. But yeah, I think once again, the water budget was not quite universally, but the vast majority of the Planning Commission was in support of that. And a lot of that really came from wanting to minimize the increased work burden on staff. And as that seems to be kind of the most easily implementable. And then, yeah, there's a general kind of being in favor of hydrozoning, irrigation, and then the plant list serving as a suggestion. which I think in a lot of ways, like everybody has kind of expressed fondness for in our meetings as well. But that's all I have.
Thanks, Luke. Jason or Tawny? Jason.
So maybe I'm not saying it in here, but are there people with water shares in the city limits? And if people do have water shares, how does that go into this? Are they exempt from this because they have those shares, or will they then need to adhere to these standards even if they have the shares, that they own the shares to water a lot more turf than what is allocated for them? That'd be, and then my other question was like the same standards for like gray water. Like, would it be worthwhile incentivizing people to put in gray water hookups or something if they were recycling the water that they were using, or putting gray water back into the ground, instead of just feeding the sewer plant and then the sloughs or whatever or whatnot. Anyway, those were two things that I kind of was curious about.
Carly, you're unmuted. Did you want to make a comment?
Oh, Mila can answer too. I just thought maybe there would be a couple of us answering.
Okay. Mila.
I can just address the gray water piece really fast. So the water budget is designed to accommodate incentives. One of them would be gray water or rainwater capture as well. I think there was at least another one contemplated, but if you look at the calculation pages, I think that's in there. So you would essentially be allowed to have more water applied to your landscape if you did employ a gray water system.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's flexible too. If the council was interested in adding, other types of incentives in that way, the water budget can accommodate that, or the water budget approach.
Perfect.
Yeah, and regarding like who would be regulated, depending on whether they were like a city municipal water user or like a private well user, it depends on where we would like house it in the code and how we could structure it. If it's a land use, part of the land use code, then it's applicable basically to everyone generally, but it can be maybe tailored to be specific to our customers if desired.
Tawny?
Yeah, I'm glad Jason asked the questions about water shares because I was curious about that also. And in general, I'm in favor of staff recommendations and planning commission recommendations. I just wanted to say that we've had this in front of us kind of off and on for quite a while. I'm glad to hear that planning commission favored not being quite as strict with residences as they are with commercial development. As I was reading this, I thought, man, this is really detailed, and the average homeowner isn't going to get through this before they want to do something in their yard. But I'm glad to see that there was a little bit of flexibility for just an average homeowner versus a commercial developer. So that's just my 2 cents. So
thanks, Tawny. Kaylin?
Okay, having had some discussion time to process these square footage limits in the staff recommendation, I'm just wondering about at the bottom end, also having the 2,000 to 8,000 square feet of development requirements triggered if the landscaped area is above a certain area. So because you could have a large property with a relatively small building that's actually has the potential for the landscape to use a lot more water if it's than a large building with a relatively small amount of landscaping.
So would you envision something along the lines of like an either or statement? So either 2,000 to 8,000 square feet of development, or I guess, and or a certain number of square feet of landscaped area would then trigger those requirements?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a number in mind? for what that landscaped area might be?
No, I'd have to give it a little bit of thought. Sorry. I realize you're
That's
trying
okay. Yeah.
to know now, but no.
Jason, you're unmuted, so when I see unmute, I think you might have a comment. Do you have anything? Okay, he muted himself. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap this discussion up. It sounds like the majority, if not all, of the council is in supportive of the staff recommendations with the water budget, include a plant list and hydro zones. Correct me if I didn't pick up on, if I'm not right here, and some irrigation requirements. And looking at landscape square footage as opposed to just the size of the actual development. Did I get that right, everyone? All right. So Mila, I think you've got some direction, and go forth and do good.
Thank you so much.
We'll look forward to hearing back from you on, I'm assuming that we're going to see the final plan. I mean, the final outcome, right?
Yeah, if that works for you, then we'll turn this into a proposed code update and take it to Planning Commission.
You know, one thing I forgot to add to that list is the educational component. I know you've mentioned that. I think it's really important. That's a big piece of all of this. If we want people to be compliant, they need to know the reason for it. And so if you could include that in that document, or, you know, the recommendation or the final thing that we get, that would be great.
Sure, I will. And I just wanted to mention that the reason that we have been waiting on that is because we wanted all of our education and our code to be consistent. So we needed to make sure we knew what we were moving forward with before we started telling the public about what we were planning to do and what they should do.
All right, thanks, Mila.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. All right, moving on to agenda item 7.2, staff update on a draft ordinance 2022-05, an ordinance amending the Moab Municipal Code R3/R4 zones with active employment housing household requirements. And we've been talking about this for a while. We did get some information back from our consultants regarding the active employee household. We also got some information from our attorneys. And so I'm going to turn this over to Corey for some discussion. We will be taking action on this at the end of the month. The public, and I think Corey, you're going to go over that timeline. The Planning Commission will be having a public hearing this Thursday. They'll be voting on it on Tuesday of next week. And then we will have some public comment and vote or consider, up to you guys, the approval of the ordinance with the AEH requirement on our special meeting on the 31st of March. So Corey, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Want to extend my appreciation to Rob Keller and Nate Mitchell with Snow Christensen Martineau, and then Aaron Nussain with BAE staying with us tonight. So welcome back, everybody, once again. I do have just a really brief presentation overview, nothing dramatically different than what we've seen in the past here. But again, to frame the conversation in which we're going into the discussion about our active employment household ordinance 2022-5. Tonight, what we're hoping to do again is just reiterate opportunities for public engagement in this process, for the public to speak to the Planning Commission and to the Council in regards to this framework and the formulation of the data that we're proposing. From the Council to get definitive direction on the finalizing language and content of the framework of the ordinance. And then the considerations from that we have from Snow Christensen. So with Rob and Nate, really not giving a presentation at this point, but more so response to any legal considerations or questions we might have about now. What we're starting to meld is BAE's data and formulation structure, and how we can utilize that as the rational basis for the percentage requirement that we're going to include in the ordinance. So Again, as we've been rapidly updating this information, the public notice packet had as up-to-date information at the time. Some of the information we're having now has been updated, so the council has been shared with that, and we're going to get that out to the public in a public forum as well. So everyone should be able to access the materials that we're talking about tonight and being able to review this updated formulation structure, as well as the red line that we're currently reviewing. In regards to the timeline, where we're at now is getting very close to the end of our little chart here. So we're entering into what is going to be really our last workshop discussion area for the city council. And then again, as the mayor had mentioned, this Thursday going and opening up the public hearing at a regular planning commission meeting, and then going into next week, flip-flopping what the normal order is and having our special planning commission meeting on Tuesday to officially recommend whatever draft of the ordinance that we're really taking the information from the council tonight to incorporate for that public hearing. And then finally, city council hopefully approving an ordinance on the 31st. We have budgeted in some emergency backup special meetings if needed. If there's any very last minute information, my hope is at this point, in the way in which we've structured this, is it's really a grappling with the data and understanding of where we're at versus major considerations of discretion. It is basically, this is what is defensible and what we can do, and we either like that or we do not like that. The variability in there is where we may create some challenges. Again, the framework for the ordinance has not dramatically changed. We've reduced some of the chapter component in the enforcement section in particular, removing a lot of the excess body, i.e. creating its own form of enforcement just for this, and really just grouping that into our broader zoning enforcement section. So we do have some regulations of when a property or development that would be complying with this chapter would be in violation. So that is profiled, but then also how that violation is processed jumps back into what our general enforcement policies are. So it cleans it up in a much better way. I think everyone's been pretty happy with that. So that's really the extent of my recap and presentation here. I do have our red line ordinance that the council should have received and everyone should have up to date. The public should have most of this material in their open packets that we were able to publish last week, but there are some minor changes that we've added on behalf of Snow Christensen and Martineau's red line, just to bring most of the language into a consistent formatting with other sections of our code. We've also included some comments from council, specifically from Councilmember Jones. Last meeting, we had discussed the parking requirements and access. So we've removed that. That was the direction the council wanted at the time. So that's one of the inclusions that may be different than what we have seen before. And as we're just scrolling through quickly, we're more than welcome to go back through this in detail as we're getting into more of the discussion, but just want to, again, do the overview. An added section here about when that percentage breaks down into a decimal system, which we've talked about before very early on in the process. It was just being included here as we start to talk about the percentage. And then into the enforcement and violations area, really taking out a lot of the superfluous information. So with that, I also have this working document that I think Aaron will take over and walk through. And then this is a breakdown of households that we might be able to utilize later in the conversation. So that all being said, I'll stop sharing screen. And Mayor, I think at this point, I'd like to turn it maybe over to Aaron for the presentation, and then open it up with Rob and Nate to respond to any council member questions now that we'll have the whole context, if that makes sense, and how you'd like to move forward.
Right. So I think you guys made a great presentation at our last meeting. So I don't know if the council wants us to get into that kind of detail. But I think really what we want to know is how, you came to this percentage and then have a conversation around that. So Aaron?
Great. Thank you, members of the council. Again, my name is Aaron Nussain. I'm an associate principal with BAE Urban Economics. I've had the pleasure with working with Corey to help understand what the percentage of new residential development in Moab should be set aside for active employment households. We've gone about that using two different approaches. For both of them, the process starts out by just sort of understanding what the remaining build-out capacity is within the city. And so we worked with Corey to develop these development capacity assumptions for each zoning district, sort of estimating at full build-out from scratch what, how many residential housing units and how many square feet of new non-residential development the city could accommodate. We then backed into some numbers of how much development is already existing within the city so that we can understand what the net remaining capacity sort of looks like. And that's essentially what table 2 is covering here. So we've got the gross capacity. This is just looking at the total acreage within the city and using those development factors. We have existing development as best as we can estimate it. And so we're accounting for existing residential units that are in commercial zones, existing residential and commercial square footage in all kinds of different zones to get at an adjusted gross capacity and then to a remaining capacity. So then we move into the real percentage calculation. So tables 3 and 4 are really the meat of the question. So the first approach that we took was looking at just residential development. Assuming the city builds out with all of its remaining capacity, those housing units would then be occupied to a certain extent. Those occupying households would be spending dollars in the community that would be supporting additional commercial development and additional non-residential jobs. Then we convert those total jobs into workforce housing units, and we make an assumption with regard to the portion of those workforce households that would be living within the city of Moab. So based on that general approach, we're estimating that if you want to maintain your current share of the workforce that's living within the city of Moab, it's estimated at about 46%, you need to set aside about 8.5% of the total remaining residential build-out capacity within the city of Moab. If you wanted to only apply the active employment household regulations to the R3, R4 zones, you'd be closer to a 14.5 or 15% percentage. Any questions on these calculations before I move to the second method?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the second method is looking at total commercial build out within the city of Moab. So you have additional, commercial capacity that's going to build out that will be supporting, residential households that are living outside of the community, recognizing that Moab is somewhat of a hub for goods and services, and then also catering to your visitor populations. So the second method that we used was to look at total build out of the commercial land within the city of Moab and using kind of average employment densities per square foot of non-residential use. And we tried to tailor that to the types of uses we generally expected to see within each commercial zone. We again estimated total commercial employment at build out and then converted that to workforce households. And again, if the city is looking to maintain the share of the total workforce that lives within the city at 46%, more or less where it is now, you need to set aside about 42.5% of the citywide remaining residential development capacity. If you want to restrict it only in the R3, R4 zones, you'd be looking at more of a 74% percentage. And there's many intermediary calculations that went into these estimates. I'm happy to unpack that to the extent that you'd like.
Great. Questions from the council? I don't know if you guys want him to leave this up so you can look at these numbers, or if we can take that down. Why don't we go ahead and take it down, Aaron? And if we need to bring it back up, we will. All right. Caleb.
Thank you for that, Corey and Aaron. So do you have a recommendation at this time, or are you still, do you want us to discuss goals first? I'm just sort of wondering how to approach this.
Sure.
One row that was shaded, but no number has yet been inserted into the draft ordinance.
Right. So the purpose of my analysis is really to frame a range of potential options. So you have the more conservative estimate that is looking at just the offsetting impacts of new residential development, where essentially you can draw a really clear nexus between the impacts that those residential projects are having on the community in terms of new workforce housing demand, and then you're requiring them to offset that. The commercial piece is a little bit different, where you'd be looking at having residential builders set aside units that are restricted to a certain market when that's not necessarily as closely tied to their direct impacts, their own direct impacts on the market. The 46% line is shaded in gray because that's reflecting the active employment household units, or the percentage of the potential residential build out that would need to be set aside for active employment households in order to maintain the current share of the workforce that's housed locally versus those that are, commuting out to residential locations outside the city.
Okay, thank you. So I was thinking about this, and it does seem like rough proportionality is better supported in Table 3, is my impression. But we also, as many cities do, sort of segregate broad classes of use via our zoning. So even though commercial development may induce more housing demand, the way our zoning code is set up is anticipated that it will be accommodated in our residential zones. So it seems like there is potentially a connection there. But my understanding is that it's a little bit subjective and untested how we proceed with this. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think, and Mayor, depending on how you'd like to go from this conversation, it's seeming that we're kind of edging into this territory now, or maybe a comment from Robert and Nate might be helpful, is towards the intended point in which we're going to pick on this scale. I think what we're seeing is a floor and a ceiling, and that we have rough proportionality to stay within this realm. And like Aaron and Kaylin had noted, there are different methods that are, I think, tethered. I don't think we can necessarily remove one from the other, or the impacts that we're needing to recognize. But what we, I think, should also remember is that we are addressing a particular issue through a use parameter, and we are approaching it from that context that this occurrence in our R3 and R4 in particular is the removal of attainable housing. So this use parameter is retaining a certain percentage of that. The way we've come to that is through this build out capacity. So while there might be specific components in which we can tie, it's all, I think, a framing context. So that really all this rambling is meant to intend is, I think at this point we need to settle on a percentage that I think is somewhere between that range, that we feel comfortable with, that we can defend, but is also linked to that proportionality.
Other questions from council? Ronnie. Oh, Kaylin, excuse me, Ronnie, did you have something you wanted to add or no?
I can save it and let others go for a while.
Okay, Ronnie?
We were asked to submit questions earlier, so I'm guessing we'll get answers to those later, and this is probably not the place for those types of questions. So when you guys are just talking about determining a number, is that something one just hashes through in a meeting? Are there elements of that that involve legal advice? Does one need that legal advice in a closed session before one can calculate that? I kind of need that to understand process.
Rob, you want to take that?
Yeah, so if I can respond to that, I think those are great questions. I think Councilmember Jones had some good questions earlier that he circulated by email. I thought those were perceptive and good questions. My view is that since I think this is, and Aaron's presentation was helpful to understand the correlation between the 3 and 4 on his report. But I think what would be most helpful is if we were able to kind of evaluate these ranges and provide an update to our legal memorandum to the council, so you could understand perhaps the pluses and minuses on both sides of those issues. And then I think, you know, with that advice and with input from Corey, we could perhaps make a recommendation, or at least better describe what the pros and cons are on each side of that range. I think that would be helpful. I think that would be helpful to the council if we could do that. And I think we could do that in the next couple of days. I think it would be helpful to have a conversation perhaps with Aaron and Nate and I and Corey tomorrow morning, where we could kind of go into these numbers in more detail and into his analysis in more detail, and then make a kind of a recommendation from a legal standpoint. I think that's what would be helpful to the council at this point. I'm not sure we're ready to make a decision on what that number is yet. And Corey, help me if I'm wrong, but I think we could do that in the next couple of days. But at this point, I don't think we're there.
I think the problem is the planning commission is having a public hearing on Thursday. So the council is going to need to be able to make a recommendation to them so that they can hold their public hearing. I think, Luke, I mean, they're waiting for us to give them some number, and without that number, they can't have a public hearing. So a couple of days, I'm concerned that a couple of days is not going to meet that timeline.
I think as far as processing and what we're obligated to do as far as noticing and the requirements of a text amendment that we need, that isn't necessarily the case. Really, the final draft is going to come in a certain context to that public hearing. So the need for the council to comment on that before, I think, is an advanced accommodation which we're trying to allow. It's not a necessary component to allow them to move forward. So the planning commission will make a recommendation based off of staff's recommendation, which is kind of the grunt work here. And then it will come in a more polished setting. And again, we're breaking those two out. So the public hearing will be one set. The planning recommendation will be the next week. So there is some time even in between those to further refine this, and then finally coming before council as a approval document. And I may have missed that, but Summer can check me. I believe that's our obligation to process. Or Rob.
Nate, did you have a comment?
I was just going to add briefly, Rob, and cut me off if I'm saying anything untoward, but I think we had a conversation with Corey earlier today in which we talked about having that conversation with BAE and Aaron and just perhaps tuning some of the points. But that said, I think the basic framework that we've already provided to the council in the form of a memorandum still applies. And the questions that Councilmember Jones is raising are really perceptive ones. And Aaron, in some respects, addressed some of those questions. So while we're happy to go back and add and supplement to our memo, ultimately what it's going to come down to in some respects is, whether or not, I'm trying to figure out a way of saying this delicately, whether or not the council has confidence that what's being regulated is use. Just like Corey had commented on, this ordinance is very much directed at use, and different standards may apply depending on whether or not that's true. But I think that's sort of a threshold and driving factor in terms of what percentage the council reaches. So I'm sorry to speak in some generality, but it is a sensitive subject and it's a complicated analysis. But I think the basic framework is there in the memo, and Aaron addressed perfectly, the distinctions between Table 3 and Table 4.
Thank you. Council members. Corey, did you want to say something?
I've reframed my comment from earlier, but I think I might save that. We'll have that discussion, I think, with Rob and Aaron. I feel confident in this process. I feel confident in the ordinance that we are not getting into territory at this point that is not approvable. I think at this point, it's a matter of where within that we're dealing. And again, I really, in my mind, believe that we're pursuing this as a use parameter within the zoning code. This formulation of data is evidence to support the need for workforce housing. So we're saying anecdotally, our R3 and R4 our zones are being replaced with unattainable housing, which is factual, but anecdotally to a certain percent. Okay, we know this is happening, so we're putting in a use parameter to regulate that. How can we provide evidence to ensure that that is accurate? I believe this formulation of data is evidence saying there is a need for workforce housing. In fact, we're in a deficit by a strong amount, I'd say. So this range that we're in, I think, gives us tangible scope to be within. But the direct tie, as it might be with a different, again, now Nate was trying to be kind of vague, I'm trying to be vague myself. A direct tie, like we might see in a different type of zoning tool, wouldn't necessarily be, I think, the exact line of thinking. I think we're using this as supplementation. We need to keep that context. So again, that all being said, feeling confident about this moving forward and finding somewhere in the middle that makes sense.
And if I may, Mayor.
Go ahead, Nate.
I'd just echo what Corey said as far as it really, staff has done an excellent job in terms of framing this as a use parameter. And if it's a regulation on use, the way this data is framed to underscore a need that needs to be addressed through a municipal ordinance is exactly how you justify a use parameter. And so I just want it to be clear, we don't, Rob and I do not disagree with that. Our job, of course, is to assess risk. And so we sit in a slightly different place than Corey does. But as far as regulating use, the study is very, very helpful in terms of underscoring that need.
Great. Thanks, Nate. Luke?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions, or I guess like clarifications that I'd appreciate. So it looks like the highlighted numbers are based off of that 46%, which is our current workforce that is living within the city of Moab, correct?
That's correct. So that's based on data from the U.S. Census Bureau, a tool that they call LEHD on the map tool, which is one of, frankly, only a handful of sources where you can get in and out commute data. And that's based on, I believe, the 2019 5-year ACS. And the 46% is the share of the workforce for all jobs in the city of Moab that the city of Moab. Everybody else is commuting in from outside the city.
Right. And then I guess kind of just clarification on something I think I heard Corey say, where the data kind of bears out that there is a deficit. Is there any sort of assumption as to like what that deficit is in these numbers, or are these numbers kind of starting at an assumption that like there's parity and moving forward to maintain this like proportionality, we need this percentage to like maintain that?
Well, I think the tables that I've presented don't necessarily fully frame the idea that there's a deficit of workforce housing, but there are pieces in this that I think do support that general position. One is simply that 46% resident workforce percentage, saying that you've got 53% of your workforce that's coming in from outside the city. And I think Corey can also add other data that speaks to, you know, the relative affordability of housing compared to workforce wages. And I have also collected a little bit of that data. I'm not sure I shared that with Corey, but I have a little bit of that that I can provide to him as well to support that general position.
Okay, that's helpful. And I guess it's not so much like a question, but just a comment. I remember in the workshop I brought up how water availability might actually potentially be one of the limiting factors and not just total build out. And so I was able to find the Moab water facts, like fact sheet from June 2019 that stated that current estimates of groundwater use are 2,283 acre feet of water, and that estimates of groundwater production potential are 5,401. And then they actually had projected groundwater requirements for the city at build out, and that was at 9,434 acre feet. So it looks like it's not quite, but like a full city build out would require twice as much water use than we're currently projected to have in terms of groundwater production potential. So just to potentially factor that into our decision-making process.
I'll let Corey respond to that. We generally based our build out estimates off of, you know, assumptions that the city developed.
Right. And again, expanding this audit would have been the preference. I think scope and time were not in our favor here. But again, what we're trying to look at is a very precise tool. So while build out, I don't think we're quite there yet to be using mechanisms like that in this instance. I think in the future, that's absolutely going to be an accommodation where we have that supported and included. And again, and this is kind of reference back, is this data formulation is a little less about what our current status is and more about build out. So that use of need based on what is to come, it's like Aaron's saying, not accounting for a deficit that we may or may not be in. But I think, again, relying on the data that wasn't included, which includes overnight accommodations and nightly rental business licenses, it was a factor, but not a substantial enough factor to equate uniquely within this formula. That's a factor. And then, of course, as we all understand, the affordability component. While we have these unit numbers for dwellings in all these zones, it's not talking about what those uses we're making assumptions about what they're used for based on a variety of data being backfilled on it. But this is the use, the impact that is coming off of these uses. So a second homeowner and a local homeowner are generally taking about the same use to some degree. So this is not identifying the number of units that are existing not on the market, whether they be nightly rental, overnight accommodations, or second homes exclusively for vacation rentals, which is not, it does factor those in as far as their impact, but not as far as the amount of housing and where we land in that. So I guess I'll leave it there that we could have dug a lot deeper, but without a full audit, this scope is what is most effective to address this particular issue. So as we start to address other issues, I think we're going to add in some of these variable concepts, but this was the most appropriate we found.
Yeah. Corey, if I can add, for the residential numbers in table 3, that percentage should more or less scale. So if water constraints essentially limit residential build out to half of what's being estimated, that percentage should more or less stay the same. The bigger change would be if you're only able to build out, if the predominant residential use type changes. So if rather than having the current mix of single family and multifamily, if you could only build out single family or only build out multifamily, that might affect it a little bit. But for the most part, it should be scalable. On the commercial side, there's a little bit of a difference there. Commercial tends not to be a huge water user because you can have significant square footage and maybe you have a bathroom and a sink. They use far less water than residential uses do. And the commercial is also being supported by residential uses that aren't necessarily located in the city of Moab. And so there'd be a different relationship there, and that would take more research to unpack.
Thanks, Aaron. Jason and Tawny, do you have any questions, any comments?
I was going to throw out that I agree with Ronnie, that, or in what she was saying, about the number and how we come about it and what comes first. My big thing is we do have that number, and we say this is a number, even though it is defendable or whatnot. My only concern with that is that even if it is defendable, we need to make sure that the developers or whatever can work within those numbers to make projects work, that they're not going, I can't do this at this rate, this percentage. It just, this project is not viable, and so that's my concern, is that no matter what that number is, that we could, in some ways, if it's too high, squash development altogether because developers just walk away, because it doesn't fit within the constraints of what they're trying to do. So that's my only 2 cents on this and then what is that number and how do we figure that out, which I think Corey and, I guess whoever, I can throw something out there, but it'd just be kind of, not really it'd be based on this, but very loosely based, so I think could what developers and stuff could pull off, or what we pull off in the town.
Tawny?
I don't really have an awful lot. Just this has been really helpful to help me understand this and the process. I too would appreciate just a little bit more clarity on the legal end of it. So I'm happy to wait for a day or so to get some more information, as long as Planning Commission can move ahead on their end with that 1 percentage, or the percentage is still not decided. So yeah, I would just appreciate a little more clarity in the legal, the memo.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, it sounds like Kaylin.
This is just a comment for Corey, or directed to Corey. I appreciate that you included my suggested edits to the AEH definition, but they were just suggestions. I realized that if they were adopted, it would make it different than that for wherever else it is we have it. I was just trying to, even though I voted for it the previous time, in rereading it, I realized that there were perhaps some ambiguities that could be tightened up. But so if the Planning Commission has time, maybe they can hash it over, or I'm not sure what, but it's just like, they were just suggestions.
Sure, and then most of those were contextually towards a more consistent solution between the two. When we had originally adopted most of these definitions, they were constructed specifically for ADUs. So I had already, in the original ordinance, changed and amended some of that language and information so that it was a more universal use between different types, ADUs and now active employment households. So your comments I didn't include, I think 100% of the amendments, but those that were, I think, really good observations and good amendments. So that's, yeah, what you're seeing in there.
Okay.
The special provisions is really the only section that really didn't translate exactly, if you recall those.
Okay.
But thank you for those. And yeah, would like to see them included.
Okay.
Ronnie?
I don't need to spend time repeating them here, Corey, but since we did get documents today and we're asked to send questions, I guess just answers to those, whether they come from you or the attorney, I think some of them are simple and I don't know if some of them have to go to the attorneys, would just help me whenever that's doable.
Yeah, for sake of time, we can get back to you on those. I don't think there were any that were large that might be good here, but if there is one that I'm overlooking that you would like discussed, I think we could address most of those if you wish.
Great. So it sounds like what the council would like is for the attorneys to add to their memorandum with some pros and cons to numbers and hopefully have a number ready for planning commission and for their public hearing. And then we'll consider it, we'll have an opportunity to respond. And then at our meeting on the 31st, we can have a deeper debate on that number. Am I right on this? Am I thinking? If and have staff kind of give the recommendation based on what Rob and Nate come up with in their memorandum, or based on what Rob and Nate come up from a legal perspective. And then the council, when we have our public comment hearing, will have that number. The planning commission will have that number. And then, if there's some discrepancy or we want to look at that further, we'll have that opportunity on our March 31st meeting.
That is correct. I think this is the last time city council will see it before it is time to approve.
Okay.
So there won't be an additional comment discussion opportunity for council. However, again, the justifiable one or possibly option of one or three, I don't know, numbers and the rationale between maybe what that selection scope would be could be included throughout planning commission, and planning commission will make a recommendation on which they believe most accurately and is justifiably associated with this. City council can then do the same in the meeting, of course, to approve it. They approve as a modified document with whatever that is. And I think we'll have Robert there. I don't know if we'll have Aaron there at that point. His job will have been done.
Right.
But I think Robert is intending to be there as well. Nate.
Perfect. Luke, did you have any more comment? No? Okay. All right. Well, Ronnie? Muted. There you go.
I did realize, Corey, there was one of those questions that would be useful to have an answer to now. So on our timeline, we have some things described as special comment periods. And just so the public and I understand what that means, what does that mean? Yeah.
That means that at the meeting on the 31st, public will be able to make comment at that time. So it's not really an official public hearing, but it's kind of like citizens to be heard, right? And that they can make their comments on that particular item during the meeting. And then you guys can decide based on those comments if you want to table the decision, within that timeline. I mean, hopefully you'll be able to make a decision, but you do have the option to table it to make a decision at a later time before we run out of the deadline.
Can we make sure that that's clear on the agenda so people know that the comment period?
Yeah.
Thanks.
We can do that. So staff, remind me to make sure that we make that really clear so that public knows that that's an opportunity to comment.
Mayor, it is listed on the agenda that you signed that it says public comment, briefing, and possible action.
Right.
In bold.
Okay. All right. I think we're good to go. Corey, Aaron, Nate and Rob, thank you for taking the time out. Really appreciate all the work on this, and I hope that we're going to come up with a good number to allow active employee households to continue to be here and live here and work here. So very good. Thank you. Okay, new business. I am going to, at this time, at 7:50, close the public hearing for two ordinances, ordinances 2022-03 and ordinance 2022-6. And I'm going to, Danny, is Danny on the call? Do we need to, or I don't know if anybody has any questions. I think Danny and Marcy were able to, there's Danny.
Yep, they both should be joining.
Okay. So does council have any questions on ordinance 2022-3, which is the pay plan schedule? No questions? Danny, do you, Ronnie?
I just thought, given the comment we got in writing about the pay plan, if I recall properly, it was a question about someone writing to say they supported the COLA, but they were wondering why the city didn't set a living wage for our residents. And I just, we get this question once in a while, and I always find it helpful to repeat and educate. Can someone correct me if I'm wrong? I don't think in the state of Utah that that's something that a local government is allowed to do, but can someone just remind me, and that way that person gets an answer?
Ben or Danny?
I don't know the answer to that. Ben, do you?
I'm not aware of any municipalities that have set that, and I'm not sure if that's within the municipal power. We could definitely do some research on that.
Okay, yeah, if you could check. I feel like I've been told in the past that it wasn't something that we could do, but it'd be great to, things are always, changing, or it's always good to verify information. That'd be great.
Thanks, Ronnie. And Danny and Ben, I think one of the questions that was raised is an explanation on the COLA, so that people understand why, the COLA is what it is and how we come to that number. So if you could just address that issue, and then if council has any questions, I'll ask for a motion.
So I'll take the COLA question, because this salary survey is really an HR function historically, and in most organizations, the COLA is typically a finance function. So city policy outlines really two primary mechanisms for base wage adjustment. First is merit increase, and that's what most people are familiar with. That's basically your annual performance. And if you're performing at a high level, that's how you move up within a salary range. COLA is the second mechanism, and that's a little different in that it moves the pay scale for all employees. So it actually shifts the pay scale up, as well as the wage within that pay scale. So typically a COLA will be something between 1% and 3%, primarily based on inflation, the current rate of inflation. And the city policy allows some latitude for the calculation of that. In my experience, we've typically used the Social Security Administration creates a COLA calculation annually that's nationwide, and then we use regional data to blend that to come up with a local-based COLA. In this case, given the current economic environment, which is quite abnormal, where it's a high inflationary environment, the Social Security Administration set the COLA at 5.9%. And if that sounds familiar to anybody, it's because that's also what the county adopted for their budget process. So I didn't feel like this year that it would be appropriate, given that high rate of COLA, to use any local or regional values to increase that from 5.9%, because it's already extremely high. Kind of as a side note, the Bureau of, the BSI, whoever calculates the the
Consumer Price Index.
Consumer Price Index is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There we go. The BLS does the CPI. So the rolling 12-month inflation rate is 7.9% through February. So very concerning economically, but how that influences the cost of living adjustment is really, it's a staff recommendation and council decision. So I think one thing to note with the city revenue is that there's a direct relationship between inflation and our revenue sources. Barring any, change in like statutory change with sales tax revenue, our sales tax adjusts with inflation. So it makes sense that all of our costs adjust with inflation simultaneously. So that's why in this case, we recommended a 5.9% COLA, which oddly enough feels a little bit conservative in the current environment. So any questions about the COLA for this COLA recommendation for this year?
Questions for Ben? All right. Questions for Danny regarding the pay plan schedule? All right, I'm going to ask for a motion to approve proposed ordinance 2022-03. Tawny?
I can move to approve ordinance 2022-03 and ordinance adopting the City of Moab pay plan schedule and adopting the exempt and elected officials' salaries for fiscal year 2022-2023.
Thank you, Tawny. Second?
I'll second.
Second by Luke. Any discussion, Tawny?
No.
Luke? Discussion? Nope. Anybody else? All right, I'll ask for your vote. Tawny?
Aye.
Luke?
Aye.
Jason?
Aye.
Ronnie?
Aye.
Kalen?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Next item is proposed ordinance 2022-06, an ordinance amending Title III of the Moab Municipal Code to update Chapter 3.50 Master Fee Schedule and modifying certain fees and rates charged by the city. Marcy, do you have anything you'd like to let the council know about?
Yes, so there was a couple of questions that came up from council, and one I want to address specifically is how we don't have like our vehicle charges and things broke out in the fee schedule. And so Tawny was kind enough to send us what they use for the county FEMA. We are going to assess that. We do have to open the fee schedule up again for the AMRAC, the pool that is also under assessment for fees. So we're going to make that a priority to add those fees and have them assessed and ready for council review and approval. And then also to note that the master fee schedule is a running document. So it is open to be changed. It's not a one-time year type change. That's how we do it so that we can assess the fee schedule and make sure that the information is accurate and current to whatever rates we might be charging or need to increase. So I wanted to put that out there. So that'll definitely be added. And thank you, Tawny, for that question. Ronnie also asked some clarifying questions about why we were increasing the city utility deposit. And I do apologize. I thought that I had the little notes in there, but I must have accidentally accepted or deleted it. But we're doing the increase because one, the $25 is really low. A majority of our utility bills are anywhere from $100 to $160 for residential alone. And so increasing this will allow, if somebody does not pay their utility bill, they close the account and move, at least we can get some of that money put back onto the utility account and cover any fees that may have been associated to final billing. We also only hold the utility information for, or excuse me, the deposit for 12 months if they have consistent payments and consecutive on-time payments is what I'm trying to spit out here. And so we don't hold that $100 permanently for the life unless we have issues where they're not paying on time. And commonly, those are the accounts we want to have that large of a deposit on. So I hope that cleared up any questions that you had on that, Ronnie, as well. And then there was a correction that I need to make on the ordinance to remove AR. I apologize. I use abbreviations all day, so I didn't even think when I put it in the ordinance, but it's accounts receivable. And I think that the majority of it is pretty self-explanatory for what we need to do for the changes. Any questions?
Questions for Mercy? Ronnie?
Oh, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for the way you put it together because it was really easy to follow the agenda summary, to have all of the changes truncated in one place with the little comments to explain them. So that just.
Well, you're very welcome. It was my first agenda summary to do by myself.
Nice job, Marcy. Any other questions for Marcy? All right, I'll ask for a motion to approve proposed ordinance 2022-6. Kalen?
I move to adopt ordinance 2022-06, an ordinance to remove, add, and amend fees in the Moab Municipal Code, chapter 3.50, master fee schedule.
Motion made by Kalen. Second?
I'll second.
I'll second. Oh, Jason beat me.
All right. Motion made by Kalen, seconded by Jason. Any discussion, Kalen?
No.
Jason?
No.
Anyone else on the council? All right, I'll call for the vote. Kalen?
Aye.
Jason?
Aye.
Luke?
Aye.
Ronnie?
Aye.
Tawny?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Marcy. See, I forgot to thank Danny. Thanks, Danny, out there in Cyberland. Okay, next item is a proposed resolution 08-2022, a resolution approving the McLaughlin minor subdivision of property located at 458 West, 200 South. Corey.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Hello, everyone again. I do have a short presentation on this if the council would like to see that. This is a fairly straightforward action. So if you, I'll leave that as an option if you'd like the presentation, or if you'd like just to move to questions for staff.
Pleasure of the council. Let's go with questions. Any questions for Corey? Tawny.
I don't have any. I thought this was pretty straightforward and understandable. We're just splitting a lot, making it two.
Ronnie?
Corey, thanks for explaining my math question. I'm learning so much.
Right. Yeah, on that particular comment, because I'm sure maybe anybody in the public might notice this as well, is that some of the square footage and acreage areas weren't adding up. That's often because the existing county data isn't exactly reflective of what the new survey data is. So the tax roll is 5.05 acres that's being split, and that's what the accurate subdivision is, despite it being perceived as to be 4.48 acres.
1 + 1 always equals 2 in accounting, not in land use. So.
All right, I'll ask for a motion to approve resolution 08-2022.
I will.
Tawny?
I move to approve the city council. Okay, sorry, let me start over. I move that the city council approve Moab City Resolution 2022-08, a resolution approving the McLaughlin minor subdivision of property located at 458 West, 200 South, Moab, Utah 84532.
Thank you, Tawny. Second.
I'll second.
Second by Kalen. Any discussion, Tawny?
No.
Kalen?
Nope.
Anyone else? Tawny, how do you vote?
Aye.
Kalen?
Aye.
Ronnie?
Aye.
Jason?
Aye.
Luke?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Corey. All right, don't go away. Next item on the agenda is a discussion on maximum adult residential occupancy. And this is a discussion based on some questions and concerns that we have gotten from neighbors up at Arches on Arches Drive, and other concerns around the city regarding the number of adults living in homes. And I think it's important for us to express our concerns so that the community knows that we are paying attention, and also come up with some strategies and how best we can deal with those concerns. So I'm just going to go ahead and open it up for discussion. And I think I'll start with Kaylin and Ronnie, because you both requested for us to put this on the agenda. So I think you guys would be the appropriate council members to begin this discussion.
I'll let Kaylin start.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie.
Check. So as you are well aware, we have recently heard some concerns about a particular property that sounds like it may be used to house a lot of adults. And in the past, we have also periodically had this concern arise, and largely in the same neighborhood. But there's also been concerns about sort of consistent alleged code violations for other properties, which relate to similar concerns. So I thought it might be useful just to discuss what those concerns tend to be, what our current tools are for addressing them, and whether or not they are actual problems, and how we might address it in the future. So I made a list, and I'll just run through it briefly. It seems like the issues are, or have been, people parking on landscaping, or too many cars parking on the street, fears about significant increases in traffic on previously quiet residential streets, inadequate trash service, camping in vehicles on the street and on private lots, possible increases in these conflicts due to an increase in the USU student body. And yes, so those are the issues as I understand it, and noise. And it seems like in general, some of these we have mechanisms to address them, whether or not we have the capacity to, or whether or not citizens want to avail themselves of our complaint-driven code compliance process. And then, so I'll leave it at that and pass it back to Ronnie.
Thank you, Kaylin. Ronnie.
So I shared with a lot of you a memo I wrote in 2018 to council at the time about a lot of these same issues. I always reserve the word sucks for special meetings, but I'm going to say it sucks to have to be still talking about this years later. And I don't want those of you who are new to have to still be dealing with this, but more importantly, I don't want residents to have to be dealing with this so much longer. So there's a lot of history here, and I asked our attorney Nathan Bracken to participate partially. So when we do discuss tools at our disposal, and because he's familiar with so many other Utah communities, so that it can save us from maybe contemplating any tools that we may not have, but also maybe not having a blind spot to tools that may be out there. But Kaylin mentioned a lot of things, but in some ways there's a little bit, I'm going to apologize because this is kind of complicated and interwoven, but back in, probably not long after several of us got on council, we were hearing concerns from residents about corporations buying houses in the R2 zone on their streets, and some problems that were ensuing. And sometimes it was, trash out on the street or mattresses out on the street for a long time. Sometimes it was, you're in a residential neighborhood, but, everything's growing out of control and there's trash strewn about. Sometimes it was about the question that at the time we had a definition in our code that this was a single family zone, 2-family zone, and our definition of family only allowed for related persons with up to, I think at the time it was up to 2 unrelated individuals. So in many cases, you had companies buying houses in this zone and putting a lot of employees in there, and residents were saying, Well, that's not allowed in the zone. So city, you either need to change this or you need to take responsibility for the fact that you're allowing a use that isn't allowed in your code to continue. And so there were discussions at the time, and around the same time, we had discussions, and the newer council members, I'm sure Nathan at this meeting or a future one can get into this a little bit more about our definition of family at the time and how it needed to be updated to be consistent with the Fair Housing Act and other things. So then we went through a change where we changed to a household definition in our zones that maybe previously were called like single family, got changed to single household. But the household definition basically, talked about one or more people living in a dwelling together, nothing about relationships or maximums. And at the time, there was some discussion about whether the council wanted an occupancy limit or maximum. And I think somebody else, who knows the law better than me can comment on this, but I think, generally you don't want to put a limit on related people, because you have multi-generational households and you have, people with large families, and you usually don't touch that one. But in some instances, it sounds like you do sometimes have a limit on the number of unrelated individuals. And in some cases, that's because you have maybe an expanding university or just a university town. And we all know it's pretty common for, sometimes a parent will come into town and buy a house for their kids, so their kid can live there through college with their friends. Or sometimes you have fraternities or sororities. And it's been my understanding that sometimes in Utah, you will see maximum occupancy limits just to kind of put a cap on some of that. So I'll let Nathan talk more to, what's best practice, but it does sound like it's unusual that we have no maximum, and it probably is advisable. I know years ago when we talked about the expansion of USU, and I know they hope to house students on site, but there always is kind of this question that it's good to be proactive. So some of the questions that residents have asked over the years, I think still remain, and we've never really responded to them. I mean, one was the city kind of got out of it by changing the family definition to household, but why was the city allowing a use to go on that violated our code? I don't really think those residents at the time got a fair answer, but at the same time, there are questions about what really is the R2 zone about, and I don't know that we have any tools, but people have legitimate questions, like in their minds, they moved in here into a residential zone, and they felt like corporations, specifically, a lot of times they're larger ones, national or international, coming in because it's relatively cheap to buy a house, when you have budgets like theirs in that zone. We're coming in, but that means, other people, maybe local, just local individuals or even local employers couldn't compete at the same rates. So the question is, do we do nothing? And is this the new pattern? And is it appropriate to have maybe seasonal, and I don't like to use the word bunkhouse. People in the community use it a lot. And it does get used in our meetings, but it's not defined in our code. And we've been raising this for years. So I think if we're going to continue to use it, we have to define it. But this has been a problem because it's not defined in our code. The closest thing we have is boarding house, usually, which is like a group home where you pay something for a meal. Or we have group homes. That's more of a situation where a bunch of you live together because you need some kind of assistance or shared. But we don't really have any wording, although we have the use of many unrelated people living together. And so the question has been raised, is this a use we should name in our code? Is this a use that belongs in every zone? If it belongs in every zone, is it appropriate, say, for neighbors to have a manager or someone they can call? So there have been just a lot of regular questions and or just related questions, and a lot of questions to that I've had with people around this, but certainly we've discussed in recent meetings, just in the community in general about, and this has been for years now, just resident discontent with a complaint-driven code enforcement system, and how much that stresses out people and pits neighbors against each other. But sometimes you may have a legitimate complaint, but because of some work or professional relationship with the other person, you can't say anything because there might be retaliation. So to me, talking to residents, it's all of those things kind of mixed in a messy ball. But I mean, I think one of the things that would be helpful we could start with is there are a lot of residents who don't, up in the Arches area, who don't understand how this even happened in the first place. So I don't know that we have this vested use now that may, in their minds, allow for something that's inconsistent. So anyway, I don't know if other council members want to speak, or if somebody like Corey wants to speak to, the situation and why it's allowed, or if someone like Nathan wants to talk about best practices. So I'm not, maybe it's best if other council members talk about kind of what they're hearing and, what they're concerned about trying to regulate. I guess my last thing would be, there is a sense that having a bunkhouse is, everybody wants to house local workers, but it is a benefit to a business or employer. And if there's no on-site management or contact, the dealing with any problems falls to the neighbors, especially when you have itinerant people coming through every 6 to 9 months, so that if there's no one there, it falls on the neighbors in these neighborhoods to do the education about various violations happening. And we all know we're short-staffed, so it doesn't mean when you call, some people will say to call the police, but some people won't call because they don't want to bug them, but other people, they may just not be able to get to it. So I think there has to be some responsibility taken for the impact that has on residents. It's kind of like the employer is getting the benefit of having the home there, but the other people on the street are having to, in some cases, be the narcs or the babysitters or whatever.
Thanks, Ronnie. Let's have other council members comment, and then we'll turn it over to Nathan, and then if we'll have further discussion. And then I think Barry and Corey, you can discuss that particular, where we're at with the Arches Drive situation. So Jason.
This is funny. This is like 100% in my wheelhouse on the other side. If you want to hear a famous speech, I can talk to you about my life on River Sands Road, that just talks about kind of this bunkhouse, living. I agree with everything that Ronnie's saying. And I think that, bunkhouses aren't bad. We have a bunkhouse. We have a bunkhouse out in the valley. We had a bunkhouse basically on River Sands Road. And it's a lot of work from a management point of view, and from managing it. And, if there's 10 people living there, there's 10 cars. If there's 10 cars, there's 10 boyfriends or girlfriends with cars that are coming to visit. There's people coming to take showers, that don't live there. There's things going on. There's all sorts of stuff. It has a huge impact on neighborhoods, and and being on the other end of it, I as someone who managed these, I had good relationships with my neighbors. They had my phone number. When I had employees dancing on the roof, I got phone calls, and I had to go smooth things out, and it takes a lot of work to do. It concerns me that these big bunkhouse style things are going into R2 neighborhoods, where they're not managed, where the ownership is not on site. I think Arches Drive, I've talked to the owners of that, and I feel like they have a good plan, but that's not to say that things aren't going to change in 3 years, or the next bunkhouse that goes in is going to have the same plan. And there's also kind of bunkhouse scenarios in those neighborhoods that aren't going very well, you know, and that neighbors aren't very happy about. So I think that we do need to come up with a plan as to where these type of housings go and the conditions in which they live, just to protect these residential neighborhoods. There's increased traffic, and a lot of these places have families with little kids who, no matter who it is, they're playing, there's just a lot of things that can go on, and increasing the traffic to people who you don't know is concerning, and don't have that maybe aren't vested in those neighborhoods is very concerning. So I agree with everything that Ronnie was saying, and I think that we need to kind of figure out what to do for these areas.
Thanks, Jason. Luke or Tawny?
Yeah, no, I definitely understand and can sympathize with a lot of the frustration that people are going through, particularly in a cul-de-sac. I live in a cul-de-sac myself, and just with my neighbors, it gets pretty cramped. So I can't imagine having 28 more people stuffed into that area. I guess I just do want us to be a little bit cautious about some of the potential ramifications, because looking at the zoning map, it looks like R2 makes up a pretty significant portion of our entire community. And we are needing kind of higher density housing and everything like that. And then I guess I have some concerns about people specifically bringing up like corporations, like purchasing the properties, just because I know that there's local businesses that are currently actively looking to purchase properties to house their their staff. And then I also know of like local investors who set up like an LLC to go in on a house together. So just kind of making sure that we keep some of those use cases in mind. But I also wholeheartedly agree with what Ronnie and Jason were talking about in terms of balancing all of that with the actual effects on the neighborhood, coupled with the initial intentions of the zoning that like underlines those areas.
Thanks, Luke. And just to kind of piggyback off the corporations, it's not only just big businesses, it's also a lot of nonprofits are doing the same thing. So it's across the spectrum of housing. So Tawny.
No, I agree with everybody. It's problematic, and I don't think we can ignore it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with my little neighborhood of Portal Vista, but currently there are 2 homes in my neighborhood, the one right behind me and the one 2 doors down, that are being utilized as bunk houses. The one behind me is full of river guides. I went out the other night, and there's a cross street in our neighborhood, and I'm not good with lengths. I don't know how long it is, 200 feet maybe. That the river guide house had cars parked along both sides of that cross street, from their corner to the stop sign at my house. And I told some of them they had to move their cars out onto 400 North. Our homeowners association has tried to address this, and it's just very problematic and impactful in a neighborhood. But I know that a lot of these people don't have a choice, because their employer buys the house and crams as many people into it as possible. The River Guide house is not that scenario. One of the River Guide's parents owned the house. The other house that's being utilized that way is owned by a hotel and managed by a property management company. And as near as we can tell, there are about 15 people that live in that house. And there can be 4 cars in front of it, or 9. And then we do have a couple of other homes in our neighborhood that are owned by local landlords and local employers, and they house a family, and they have not caused problems at all. So it's not all the employers that buy them and house their employees that are problematic. And I certainly don't want to make anyone homeless. I do want to remind council that when it was this body, but it wasn't this council. This council was sued about the Arches Drive house in McElhaney versus Moab. And the reason that this body's decision not to allow the conditional use permit for the D&D was overturned was because the council did not present findings of fact. They essentially responded to public clamor and fear mongering. So we have to be really, really careful in decisions that we make, that they are grounded in fact and not what somebody's afraid of. Because many times the thing that people are afraid of doesn't materialize. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think it bears further discussion.
Just really quickly, I'd like, on the other side of that though, you know, I look at it that it is a huge impact, but also if this wasn't going on, our housing shortage would be 300 times worse than what it is, you know, because a lot of these people would be buying up everything, you know, so they're not doing it because they're doing it out of necessity, and it would be impacting the local housing market even worse if these weren't going on. It's just, I guess, where it's going on that's the issue.
Right. All right, Nathan, so you're going to solve the problem for us now.
No, I have it all. I have the ordinance drafted right here. I've been writing it while we've been talking. Well, you know, the good news is I think you have a lot of options here, frankly. And really it's just going to be a question of, and Tawny, I think, hit it right on the head, this sort of thing has to be based on fact. And we need to probably do an analysis or get an understanding of what the impacts are, because frankly, I think your challenge is going to be picking between your options. And so I will just say at the outset, and I looked at a lot of the other cities that we represent and some of the cities that we don't. We represent Park City, we represent St. George, we represent a lot of these cities that are having some short-term issues. In fact, Lisa and I are, you know, this is kind of on our brain because we were just doing a short-term rental thing for a small community, Orangeville, which you didn't think would have a tourism problem, but does, because they've got a lot of bouldering activity and not a whole lot of places for people to stay. And so this is something, the idea of short-term rentals is really kind of the most common discussion right now. This bunkhouse concept where businesses are coming in and buying homes is, I think, fairly unique to you, because most of the other tourist communities we have, Park City being a good example, there are plenty of other places people can go and live that are, you know, somewhat closer than what you have. You guys are really kind of an island unto yourselves. So with that, I will say that most cities have some type of definition for family, I think, as Ronnie noted, and they all vary, but they're typically any number of related people plus a certain number of unrelated people that may be living with them, you know, 3, 4, whatever. And then, so defining family is one thing that a lot of cities use. The challenge with the definition, however, is how do you enforce that? And how do you determine who is related or not without you know, kind of going in and interviewing people? So that's one where it's hard to come up with the proof, and it is a very not only difficult to enforce, but an enforcement heavy tool. With that in mind, I think Kaylin mentioned this. A lot of these issues that you are seeing are violations of your existing code in some way or another. And so in some ways, effective code enforcement, if you have the resources to do it, and I understand that's a limitation right now, it can be another way to deal with these things. one of the things that I like to do with any type of code enforcement, and your code already has this, is couple it with business licensing. And for instance, we see this in the new accessory dwelling unit laws that the state has passed, where we are allowed to, or in fact required to have some type of business license for someone who has an internal accessory dwelling unit. And the benefit to that, and that's something that the league lobbied for pretty hard, was so that we could regulate those. If someone's not complying with their ADU, or the ADU is creating problems when they come up for their annual renewal for their license, we can revoke it. And you have authority already in your business license code that says that violations of your code, it can be a grounds for either denial or revocation. Now, the challenge, of course, is that that requires code enforcement to document the violation. So you have a structural basis, and you do have a curing process in your code as well. And so regardless of what we do, you're going to need to have some amount of effective code enforcement to document these types of things. The other thing that Ronnie touched on that I think is one that you see a lot in the short-term rentals, and certainly when we were working on for Orangeville, is having kind of a manager or a responsible person is the term that's often used. And I think, as Jason mentioned, in some cases, in my experience with short-term rentals, most of them are just fine and they don't create a problem. But there's always one or two bad apples that really create and suck up all the resources. And this is just my personal experience, more often than not, that's because the owner is not responsible. So in Jason's example, he was the neighbor, they knew who he was, they could call him and Jason could come in and one of the benefits of that situation where it's the employer, it's like, hey guys, knock it off or I'm going to fire you, or there's going to be some type of disciplinary action. Now, I'm speaking more harshly, but that's a little bit different than, say, a dorm manager coming in and saying, hey guys, I'm your buddy, be cool. And so I think that that may be one thing to do if you want to define bunkhouse or boarding house or whatever term you use, maybe couple it with business licensing and then require it to have a responsible person. So for instance, a lot of these short-term rental ordinances will have somebody has to be a responsible person and there's certain requirements. For instance, while people are there, they have to be available 24/7 to deal with issues. So that's one that I see fairly commonly used that I think could potentially be done here. All of these could be potentially a combination of things. The other thing and I think this gets to, the points that Luke and Jason made, because this is providing affordable housing and you have an affordable housing problem, is having more surgical zoning. And this is kind of a larger trend now that the legislature has basically made conditional uses, permitted uses with extra steps. A lot of cities, and I know that you've already done this, are moving away from conditional uses to permitted uses, which I think is the right move. However, and I'm doing this with a number of other cities, when you do that, you can't have the same broad zoning you used to have before. And the way things were set up in the past is the conditional use, a bunkhouse would have been a perfect conditional use because it's one of those things that could make sense if you could mitigate the impacts, or it couldn't and you could deny it. And the cities had a lot more discretion in the past, and therefore they could just have these big zones that covered a large swath of land and have a bunch of conditional uses. We're not in that world anymore. And so what I'm seeing, at least the trend that I prefer, is you just have, and it's a lot more work, but instead of having a large R2 zone, you have a bunch of different R zones, maybe some where bunkhouses are a prohibited use, others where they're permitted, and then you define them and you list the conditions, like they have to have a business license, they have an on-site manager, maybe we define the number of people that can live there. The Utah code, I think, as you may know, says that we can't limit the number of unrelated people to less than 4. If you were a university town, if you do get a university, it's a state university, you could limit it to 3, but there's no maximum. So we could go anywhere from 4 up to whatever you want. The other thing that I think is something to consider that you may even have under your existing permitting, and we dealt with this week on another project, is some of these projects are going to have resource constraints. For instance, sewer capacity. In some of these areas where if you have a single family home and you have, I know you have some areas where there's sewer short and you have something that comes in with, say, 20 some people living there, the potential loads on your sewer system could expand things. So that's something else you might want to consider if you're going to rezone areas to allow for this. And then of course, parking. Some of the short-term rental ordinances is like every time, every person there has to have one spot, which can also place, the benefit of that is it ensures that people are parking in the right place. The downside is it makes it harder to do these things and can therefore place a limit on some of your affordable housing. The other thing that I would mention about these is, I think, and this is my concern with, it's one thing when you have a local person who's there. I think getting back to this manager idea, that is usually the ideal. I dealt with a similar situation with one of those electronic scooter companies where they came in and, it's not completely comparable, but the concern was, well, what if we have all these scooters all over the place? We want to have somebody on call. And so we insisted as part of their license agreement with us that, hey, you got to have somebody in the valley available 24/7. So if we've got problems, if they're jumping up the street or they're creating a public nuisance, that we can call on somebody and they are here locally to pick it up. And so I think that you kind of have the absentee landlord thing that you might want to address in that sense. So those are just kind of the general thoughts that I have on this. I think any one of them or a combination of these might improve the situation. I don't know if you're going to have a silver bullet. And to me, the biggest concern that I have is coming up with something that's enforceable, but that is also enforceable given your resource constraints. Because we could come up with the best ordinance in the world, but if we don't have the enforcement resources to go through the necessary due process to regulate it and cite people when there's a problem, it's going to be ineffective. And then you create the image that, hey, city's not taking this seriously, or the city can't do anything about it, so anything goes.
Right. Questions for Nathan? So
I got a question. Would these type of bunkhouses where people are essentially paying to live there, would the management company need to have like a business license in regards to that, or is this kind of skate under some sort of, I don't know, long-term rental or something?
Well, I think it might depend on how, but I think in looking at your business license code, a business activity is defined pretty broadly. I think there's an argument now that these types of bunkhouses require a business license.
That's it.
And we could make that more clear. If, for instance, if we define bunkhouse and we kind of do some more surgical zoning to really specify which residential areas are appropriate for these things, we might want to make that a little bit more clear as part of the permit process. But I think right now, I think there is an argument depending on how it's set up. And the reason for that is business in your code is defined as anything in which you kind of get remuneration or compensation for service. And I don't know how all of these bunkhouses are set up, but in some of these, my understanding, Jason, is that these are a benefit that the employer is providing to the employee basically as part of their compensation package. And so I see that being very similar to, I think of Jacobs Lake because I've had some relatives who've worked there. If you've ever been there on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, they have employee housing because it's so remote. That's the only thing that they can do. And that's part of their business operations. And I see this as an extension of their other business license. Now, they may argue that their other business license should cover it. But if you're operating say a rafting company, for instance, that's not quite the same thing as operating a bunkhouse. And if you look at some of the short-term rental laws that you see around the state, there's quite a few requirements that cities are allowed to impose on those. Now, there are limitations too, but I do think there's an argument that they require a business license now. The challenge, though, if we haven't been requiring them, imposing that now does create kind of a why are you picking on me thing. So that's something you might want to think about if that's the direction you want to take.
any other questions for Nathan? Ronnie?
Nathan, I was just curious, have you dealt with college towns? And I mean, do you recommend that we have something in place in our code? I mean, colleges, yes or no, that does touch on occupancy? Yeah,
I mean, like I said, pretty much every city has a definition for family. And that covers kind of the occupancy element of things. Of course, it's very difficult to enforce those. You know, the one, and we don't represent the city, but the one that I think is, that I've read through that seemed to be the most in line with what you guys are dealing with is Logan. And they have, for lack of a better term, a party house provision in their code. It's a whole process by which, if you violate kind of the occupancy requirements, or you're having parties, or you're violating noises, there's kind of a special enforcement program that the police will go through, where they'll go and cite this, or if there's a responsible person they get in touch with. And so that's the one that seems to stand out the most to me. And that, now that's a code enforcement approach, right? And it's a very intensive one that requires the involvement of the police to go out and do an investigation and cite people. But that's the one that I, as I was looking at this today, the one that kind of stood out the most to being similar to what you're dealing with. But most cities do have a definition of family. And so that's when they have single family or multifamily, those definitions come into play. But I'm not aware of another city, and there might be, but at least the ones that I looked at today, and I looked at about 10, where they have bunkhouse or even boarding house. Those aren't things that exist now. That's usually short-term rentals or multifamily uses is where those concepts have gone.
Okay, and if it's helpful, I mean, we had extensive discussions back in 2018, 2019 about the need for our family definition to change and the move to household. And so, I mean, I think at the time, I mean, Kaylin and Tawny can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I think everybody felt like, yeah, we wanted to discard family because nobody wanted to get into the weeds of, yeah, who's related to who. And that's the problem with it, right? And most of the, I will say that most of the definitions of family are more household definitions because they're not limited to blood relatives. You know, they allow for a certain number of people that are not related. But the challenge, of course, is how do you know that? How do you determine that? You know, and how do you enforce it? I think some of the more of the discussion we had was more related to occupancy and you know, Corey and Barry can always weigh in here, but I think sometimes there are standards, or I don't know if you have to set them in your code, you know, about, you know, number of unrelated people you could have per square feet or something. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that the project on Arches Drive is, you know, allowed, is that it has enough square footage for that. So I don't know if code like that is sometimes helpful, but I was thinking too, at some point here, it's probably just helpful if Corey explains, just because I have had a lot of residents ask, you know, they're genuinely confused. They think, okay, I moved onto a cul-de-sac, you know, in a zone with, you know, with families or with individuals. So how, to them, it feels like, oh, my street is suddenly allowing, you know, multifamily, like 30 people on site or whatever, 28, in a zone where they thought, oh, that's not allowed in this zone. So they're just trying to understand the basics. But they're also trying to figure out, well, then does the R2 really mean anything? So maybe someone could put that in terms. I think it's just helpful for people watching to have that explanation.
Yeah, Corey and Barry, maybe you can kind of talk about the situation up there on Arches Drive as it relates to Ronnie's question about R2 and their vested right at this point.
Sure. I think, Barry, depending on how you want to approach this, if we want to do kind of what we do when we talk to an applicant is walk through what is typically planning, which is use and structure, and then get into building, which is structure and occupancy. And that's kind of the evolution of formatting. So the zoning verification that has been, I think, understood and shared does, I think, a pretty good job of more directly stating what parameters are allowed and in what process they would be permitted to continue or to be developed. So to break that down into a little bit more of a just plain explanation, is our R2 zone is our single household and 2 household residential zones designed specific for neighborhood type use, which we've been working on maybe adjusting that density through inclusions of ADUs and other type of tools that we were looking for an increase in housing there. So I don't want to limit it necessarily to these only 2 things, but it's those 2 things plus a few others, single household and 2 household or commonly understood as a duplex, single family or a duplex. This property was historically constructed as a single household construction, meaning it's basically the definition of a dwelling or a dwelling unit gets boiled down at its very essence to basically the kitchen. So you can have a number of bedrooms, a number of bathrooms, a number of living spaces, but what we actually look at that defines out what a dwelling unit is a kitchen. And then more specifically within the kitchen, the heating element or the range. So from that standpoint, it was a single household structure that was a B&B, 5 bedrooms that were commercial B&B use, 5 that were single family, and that was the way they maintained that. With the sale of the property and the discontinuation of that use, this new property owner came in and saw an opportunity where rather than to continue it as a B&B with 5 and then a single household use, which for most people for a length of time wasn't able to pencil. Nobody can make that particular combination of things work for the price of which the land and the house was going for. So this property owner saw the opportunity, well, if we were to essentially divide that structure for where the 5 were and the 5 household units were into a duplex, so changing the structure type and use from a single household structure into a 2 household structure and use, they would be able to then operate those as independent dwellings. From that point, we don't, through our definitions of dwelling, again, determine how many bedrooms or bathrooms you have, only the number of kitchens. Therefore, this proposed use and structure were permitted within the R2 zone in a really standard capacity. Understanding, of course, that in addition, the intent was to add additional bedrooms from the original 5 to potentially, and I'm believing now with Barry can check me, the official permit is 7 bedrooms on each side. That through that, the additional parking that may be required to house, so to speak, this type of use might be above and beyond what the typical standard parking is. So there was an additional policy included on this, that there would be above and beyond parking to be sufficiently parked for the number of bedrooms that were there, which is a consistent inclusion that we've seen on other bunkhouses in the past, where there's nobody's trying to, I think, sneak this by. Most of these are good actors. They're trying to provide a necessary use, a really needed use for our community, and most of them want to make it a well-functioning mechanism. So anyway, this parking inclusion was included here for 14 off-street spots is what has been identified. We're not necessarily explicitly requiring that, as a 2 household dwelling is only required to have 2 spots per dwelling. So they have increased that to 7 each side, total 14, to help mitigate that further. But again, the use parameters of which we have this use are permitted. And that's where I kind of end. As long as they comply with zoning that way, and then can continue to comply with the requirements Barry has for what might be the occupancy loads. Ronnie brought up the square footage per person and how that works. So that's where Barry really takes off and it becomes his show. So Barry, I'll dish it to you at this point.
Sure. So yeah, at this point, like Corey said, their concept was to turn what is a large single family home into a duplex. So that's going to involve a fire separation wall between the 2 halves, separate heating, cooling, the ability to shut off the electrical by the tenants in each side, as well as the appropriate emergency egress windows, smoke alarms, that kind of situation. The use of the structure is primarily going to function day to day like a single family home. People are going to get up, have breakfast, get ready for work, come home, have dinner. And that's not going to require anything different to the building itself. And then at this point, we've largely dealt with all the issues with plans. And I expect that the permit, if it hasn't been issued, will probably be issued in the morning on this particular project. Like has been said, there are lots of these around town. Most of them have never required building permits. We're not really aware of how many of them there are. There's also homes where the homeowner's living there, but they're renting out lots of space in their own home. So may not necessarily even qualify as a bunkhouse or whatever we're calling these things.
And this is, I think of all, Barry, if I'm not interrupting, in the past, because again, this is not the first time we've seen these come through and how to process them. It is one that was brought to a scale that notified the neighbors, but we've dealt with this before and improved in other ways before, and pretty outright with the previous mayor was quite a proponent for this. But again, the understanding of the term bunkhouse, dormitory, which are undefined terms within our code, but in the context of those that are defined. So we do have among dwelling unit, and household, which is basically, like Nathan was saying, our equivalent to a family, our household definition. It doesn't set any particular caps. Then our indirect definitions, which include those group homes, lodging houses, and boarding houses. Somewhat antiquated language that we know there's not very common in the traditional way they used to be. But bunkhouse, and of course, I don't know, everyone can see my background. I spent 5 of my 8 years in Moab living in a bunkhouse, and can safely say we didn't incur any police activity. So that all being said, I have a different, I think, association with that word, which I've come to understand most people don't view bunkhouse maybe the way I do. And they think bunkhouse, they maybe directly equate to animal house or a wild younger person, but there are a lot of working level adults living in these housing situations that because of our housing crisis are necessary. But bunkhouse comes from a historic term of use for a link to workforce housing, or there's a particular entity in which there is a working element. Dormitory is of the same quality, but tied to an educational institution. So I think both of these things are important to acknowledge that we don't have defined, but we do have them in our community. So my one little component that I might add in is I really appreciate a lot of Nathan's options. I think moving forward, the potential opportunity to maybe not work in defining household, but work in the structure of our code, which we already have, which has, or did I say household? Not work towards defining family. Don't work towards defining something that is going to be challenging to be enforced, challenging to be reviewed and improved, which is always the perspective I'm coming from, but rather work to define things that we are acknowledging, which is dormitory or bunkhouse, which would be a like definition to what we have defined as group home and lodging, boarding houses. So we don't need to define family in order to define this type of use. And then with this type of use, we can enforce or require additional regulations as we see fit. And I hope that makes sense, that where we don't need to totally define out white in order to understand what black is. What that could give us the opportunity to do is incorporate that use that would clearly be defined as maybe a potential certain number of adults that are linked to a particular workforce situation or a particular educational institution if it were dormitory. So that gives you your interpretation of use at a staff level that would define out what is a family situation, what is a different type of more elevated use. So anyway, that's my pitch, is I really liked Nathan's, I think, variety of options, particularly those that involve defining up rather than going backwards regressively, trying to define out family in a way that may be challenging. So that's my pitch.
Great, thanks, Corey and Barry. So basically, what I'm hearing is that what's happening up at Arches Drive is allowed use. They have the right to do what they're doing up there based on our current codes. But we, and you as a council, have some options so that we can manage this into the future. And so I'd like to suggest that Nathan and Corey and Carly come up with some options for council to discuss and to consider and to do this. You know, I know that planning, I know we're all stretched, and I think we want to get through this R3, R4, but I also think we want to move forward with whatever we decide to do with this particular issue sooner rather than later. So is it realistic to think that you guys could come up with something for council to consider? And council, let me know if you think this is not fast enough, but I'm thinking like June, that, you know, so that we can have we can look at these variety of options that Nathan has put forward and look at some of these issues that we can already address, that we already have, that we can address, and come up with some sort of plan for us to move forward to make sure that we can manage the situation so it doesn't impact neighborhoods so negatively. Ronnie?
I guess I have a question, and I don't know if everybody is comfortable with defining these terms, but since Corey and Nathan seem in favor of, or at least supportive of defining things like dormitory and bunkhouse, is that kind of the first step if we were going to, you know, get something more detailed in June? Is that a relatively simple thing to do in the interim? I don't know, is that as easy as having the planning commission write a definition, or how does that work?
I think my preference with these types of things is to do it holistically.
Right.
And typically when I work on an ordinance, what I try to do is what is the impact that we are trying to address? And what is the best way to achieve that impact given what the law is, what the politics are, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of using business licensing, but we saw what the legislature thinks about some of those, at least for some businesses with ATV noise. So that's something we need to tread lightly on. So my concern with doing a definition real quick is that it could have a lot of unintended consequences. And as I think I've mentioned to you each before we met individually, I'm a big fan of process. And to me, if we get the legal process right and the political process right, it'll stick. And so if we're concerned about some of these things coming online before we have a chance to get an ordinance done, maybe we could do like a declaration that we're working on something. The challenge with those is those things have to be very narrowly drafted in order to, basically they have to be drafted in such a way that there's no way that the applicant can say, hey, that wouldn't have prohibited me. And so in some ways, those types of documents have to be drafted in a way that they're basically almost a mini ordinance in a way, as you well know, having done some of those before. And so I think if there's a concern about moving quickly, from my end, I don't think June is an unreasonable amount of time to get this done. To me, I think we have a lot of options. It's really just going to be your call on what you think makes the most sense. And that's going to be obviously a council call from a policy standpoint, but then also, you know, a staff call from an implementation standpoint. But to me, I think the biggest practical challenge we're going to have is just the enforcement bandwidth.
Right.
There isn't anything we're going to be able to do that isn't going to have an enforcement component to it.
Right.
And that's going to be, that is the limiting factor, in my opinion, is doing something that's going to stick with our current enforcement resources.
Which is a whole nother discussion, you know, in general. And so Ronnie, go ahead.
Oh, so I was going to thank you, Nathan, for bringing up the notion of the responsible person. And if people are wondering why I use the word corporation, it's in part because I do feel like the local business owners who are providing housing tend to be more responsive because they know the people in town who are the neighbors who are impacted if and when that happens. So that's in part why I use it, because there's usually, you know, another degree of separation there. But at any rate, I do understand this is happening on multiple levels. So one of my interim questions would be, do Corey and Barry and Nathan feel like they understand, Carly understand kind of impacts that we're concerned about? Would it be helpful to have anything else from us before June? Or is there anything that would be helpful if one or two of us, if council members, just, solicited some more conversation with impacted residents, or did a town hall or something? I guess that was just the question. Do you have what you need?
So I'm the newest kid on the block here. I'm the one who doesn't live there, and that can be helpful in some ways because I'm outside of the community. I can provide you kind of a different viewpoint there, but I'm also probably the one who's the least impacted by this, of course. So I think it would be helpful, at least from my end, for the council members, and I think particularly Jason is someone who has operated one of these. If he has some best management practices or things that worked for him when he was managing one of those, of how was he able to keep it in line? What sorts of things would work for a bunkhouse operator? Because that's, part of this is we need to have something that's going to work for the regulated community. If we don't, they're just going to go behind our backs and they're going to do it anyway. And it's the way I see it, this reminds me a lot of the ADU discussion, and a lot, you're seeing that particularly in Salt Lake County, where you have people that can't afford to live on their own, and so they're having to rent out their homes or turn them into accessory dwelling units. And there's so much pressure that you can either do it in a regulated way in which people comply with the law, or they'll do it illegally. I call it kind of the iTunes. Remember, those of us who are as old as me, before iTunes, you had Spotify, you had Napster, and people would just download music for free. But once Apple was able to come up with a mechanism by which people could download music for a reasonable price, they would do that. And the illegal stuff went away. And that's, I think, the challenge we're going to have here. So I think it would be helpful to get more perspectives from the council, both in terms of their bad experiences, but maybe some of the good experiences. The bunkhouses that aren't creating a problem. What is it about them that makes them function in a way that doesn't create an adverse impact? And I'll defer to you to the extent that you reach out to the community. And there, as you well know, there's always a risk when you ask for community input too soon or too late. You guys know your community and your constituents better. Because one of the concerns I have is if we're still kind of in a scoping area, if we start getting too much public input, they may think that we're further along than we are. Another one of these things comes in and it could be politically difficult, but that's your call. If you think that that's necessary, feel free to do it. But I would at least like to get some more input from the council members on what they see as working and not working.
Okay, I think we can all, we all know people, and we know good landlords, and we know some problematic ones, and we know happy neighbors and unhappy neighbors. So I think we can gather that. And because I think full disclosure is important, I do live next to a bunkhouse. Okay.
So you're the expert, right, Ronnie? You'll have plenty of insight.
She is really when it comes to it.
I have practical experience.
So is Tawny, and so is Tawny for that matter.
Most of my experience comes from years of trying to unsuccessfully help people on other streets. Yeah.
So Carly, do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think about process and the best way to sort of start this conversation and keep it going. I like the idea of like a late June completion date, but we might want to come to you in May with maybe some initial ideas. Another voice that we definitely want to hear is code enforcement and code compliance, because they might have some insight about what's particularly difficult to enforce and why, and what kind of tools they would need, depending on what we're talking about. So I'll make sure they're at the next meeting and they're part of the discussion with Corey and Nathan and Barry and me and all of you as well. I really appreciate the discussion because you've helped crystallize kind of the concerns, which help us start to create a framework to tackle these impacts and these issues. So I appreciate this discussion. And I'm thinking like a May kind of first blush, and then a kind of a June refine and maybe adopt some standards, depending on how the conversation goes, of course.
Right.
And I do want to add one thing to that, and that Ronnie, to your question, and this gets back to my getting the process right politically. At some point, if we have the time, I think it will be worthwhile to involve some of the good landlords that own these things and make sure that this doesn't hurt them, or that we have their buy-in. And because I'm just going to caution you, I did find the definition. Park City has a definition for boarding house. That's the term they use. So this is kind of dealt with elsewhere. But you guys have a unique situation. And when you have unique situations, more often than not, we're probably going to have something that's the first time it's being done this way before. And when you do that, you can tend to draw attention, and you can sometimes draw a legislative veto if you don't do it right. And so, as I think we've discussed, the apartment coalition, the real estate industry is a very powerful lobby in the legislature. And so what I would hope to do is come up with a workable definition that the good landlords can accept. And so when we pass it, we can say, look, we dealt with all the key stakeholders and everybody's on board with this. Everyone agrees. Because I think, like Jason, that type of landlord, I don't think should be threatened or concerned about this, and maybe would even be supportive of having some additional resources from the city to help with this. But if we just come with something that we ram through really quickly, and I don't know, we might get some political blowback that could create some issues.
Right. And just so you know, my organization also owns a bunkhouse. So you've got two people, on this council that are good landlords. I hope I'm considered a good landlord. I'm assuming I am. Tawny has a question, and then Ronnie.
I just wanted to ask Carly, would it be helpful to you for me to provide you with the good landlords' names and contact information in my neighborhood?
Yeah, that would be extremely helpful. We'd like to know, even how they achieve that good landlord product, right? What are they doing? What works? What have they found that it doesn't work? Talk to Jason a lot. He's got a lot of experience, but yeah, I would really appreciate that.
In front of those.
Yeah, I think
I can get you that contact information.
I'm really glad that Nathan brought that up, because corresponding to this should be big public engagement. People should know what's going on, what we're kind of thinking about. We want to get that input before we take any action, or you take any action, because we don't want any unintended consequences or people feeling like they're left out of the conversation. So
good. Ronnie?
Oh, shoot. Now I have to see if I can remember my thought. Oh, that was just that I know several of you said we have to have, separate discussions about code enforcement, but because these kind of cross, should we be attempting to have some of those conversations on a similar timeline?
Yeah, I think code enforcement and code compliance should be part of these conversations. And then are you referring to Ronnie, our kind of budget questions about code enforcement as well?
I think some of these larger overarching questions too about, if people want to see changes, if they, because we get a lot of complaints about the complaint-driven system, and people have asked us what other options are out there.
I think we should, I totally agree that we need to have a conversation, but I think in terms of the maximum adult occupancy conversation that we had today with all these options, that includes code enforcement is important, but I also think we have to have a separate conversation about the bigger, broader picture of complaint-driven code enforcement in general. So Ronnie, I kind of look at those as two different conversations. If we can do them simultaneously, that would be great. I just don't know.
I didn't know if I meant in the same meeting setting. I just was thinking more on the same calendar year.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think we should
decisions by June so that we kind of know.
Yeah, and this corresponds with our budget discussions too, right? It's going to line up right with it. So maybe it can feed in nicely to what kind of investments we want to make into that department.
And to add to that, before I forget, with the time frame of a June, I think that could work unless we are doing kind of surgical zoning. Because if we're going to redo the zones, that's going to take some more time. The other thing that I forgot to mention is we are going to have to redo your general plan to include an affordable housing element that meets some of these new requirements that the legislature has enacted. That may also be a good time to have this discussion about where boarding houses or bunk houses fit within your affordable housing toolkit. I don't think that that's one of the enumerated options that the legislature's given us, but there is a catch-all provision where we could include that. And usually the general plan process, if it's done correctly, does include a fair amount of citizen input. So I know we want to get this situated sooner rather than later, but that is another process that we're going to have to go through, where I wouldn't be surprised if this discussion comes up.
Right. Well, I suggest that we move forward as we discussed, and keep it in mind that there's other processes that we'll be dealing with this down the road to deal with the conversation that we had today now, by June, and also begin our conversation with the overreaching conversation about code enforcement in general. That's what I suggest. So if everybody's good with that, we'll just wait to hear from staff and, you know, hear what you guys are, what direction you're going and what input you need from us. And we'll be available to help support the process at this point. Does that sound good from the council? For the council, thumbs up. All right. All right, Nathan, thank you. We'll be talking again soon. Corey and Barry, thank you for coming on so late tonight. Really appreciate that. And we're going to move on from this discussion to Carly's administrative report.
Hey, everyone. Good evening. Okay, I have a few things to report this week. First, we are in the process of interviewing police chiefs. We had a few last week and we continue to have them this week. And we'll be bringing some candidates to town starting, I think, next week, but the schedule is still fluid depending on their availability. And the intent is to have those candidates meet with the mayor, with council members who are interested, and with some community members who interact a lot with the police department, such as Seahaven, the Multicultural Center, the Grand County Attorney's Office. So Danny will be coordinating with you. She'll be in touch to see if you're available and interested to make those kinds of meetings.
When is this again?
For a police chief.
No, when?
Oh, when? Starting next week, probably.
Okay.
Yeah. Next Friday, April 1st, Teresa Wilhelmsen, the state engineer, and Mark Stilson, our regional engineer, are going to be coming to town. I think they're meeting with a few folks in the area. They requested a meeting with the mayor, which we've arranged. They met with Mayor Niehaus about a year ago as well. And so I think they're just making contact with new leadership in town. And just as a little tidbit, the Rural Water Users Association is holding their conference this week. And Mark Stilson told me that Teresa is intending to highlight our water resource management plan and that coalition as a sort of innovative collaboration in water resource planning. So that's exciting. And finally, the community visioning effort will be hosting a think tank on April 6th and 7th at the Grand Center. So this will happen before our next meeting, and I wanted to mention it. And we encourage the community to register and participate in that event. We'll be sending out information about how to register and how to participate. But it's a 2-evening event for community members to come and give some intensive feedback about the visioning process. We'll provide additional details about how to get involved in the future in coming days, so watch for that. That's all I have.
Thanks, Carly. Ben, do you have anything? No? All right, we'll move on to mayor and council reports, and we'll start with you, Kaylin. Are you ready?
I am ready, and I don't have anything to report. No meetings this past week.
All right, great. Thanks. Jason?
My only thing I have to report on is I went to a Grand County EMS board meeting. A little bit there. Call volume was up 25% in January, and it was mostly locals. So they had 115 calls in January. They had 99 in February, which was kind of on par from last year, from February 21. And so things are up about 4% overall, or February is up 4%, and so yeah, calls keep going up. And then the big thing with Grand County is they did a salary adjustment, which for their director, and got it on par kind of with what's going on around the state and around the country to make sure we're in line with where we should be on that stuff. So that was kind of the big thing with Grand County EMS. That's all I have to report.
Thanks, Jason. Ronnie?
Sorry, but there were a bunch of meetings. March 9th, I listened in on the city's Water Conservation and Drought Management Advisory Board meeting. They spent a lot of time on the landscaping ordinance, discussing that, and discussing the need for guidance on the future of the water board. So they're waiting for input from us on that. They meet every other month, so their next meeting's May. So I know they wanted input before then. They did talk about having a member of the water board get permission to take part in I'm still working on my new names. We're calling the Water Providers Coalition, but now I guess I don't know. I'm so confused about whether it's the management group or the coalition, but anyway. And then they did talk about sending 2 letters to the city. And one was to ask the mayor to meet with Mark Stilson and the state water engineer, Teresa Wilhelmsen. So we have the date for that now. I do think it's kind of important to know, just for folks who are on the council who are newer to water or the advisory board, that in the past, the advisory board did recommend to the city that they recommend to the state that we close the aquifer. And there was hesitation about that initially, but apparently recently there was a proposed land development near Moab City Springs requesting a significant amount of water. And so for people who don't know, Mark Stilson is the regional engineer with Utah Division of Water Rights, and Teresa is the state engineer for Division of Water Rights. And so Stilson had this request for a development that needed a significant amount of water, but he was concerned that it would possibly impact Moab City Springs. So they turned the request down. And so there is a sense that the current policy is no longer working for Division of Water Rights, and part of what they're coming to discuss is a change in that policy. Let's see, what else? Oh yes, the second letter that they sent to the city, and Luke may speak to some of this because I know this was discussed at the MOP meeting too, was a letter requesting some help from the city, because apparently Mark Stilson and the Western State Salinity Forum are concerned with the water budget in the Matheson wetlands. And apparently there is currently monitoring that the city does on how much water we use, but there's no monitoring on flow coming out. And Mark thinks it's in the interest of the city to know how much water is coming out of Skakel Springs and if it varies seasonally. What they're mainly asking for is for the city to get a quote on what it would cost to do some more, I think it's monitoring there, I might be using the wrong word, because it seems like Division of Water Rights might be able to fund it. It's not necessarily going to cost the city any money, but what they need is an estimate to go back to Division of Water Rights with. So that letter was sent. And let's see. Sorry to do so much on that meeting, but it's quite detailed. So it gives you you guys some idea of what the advisory board does. Let's see, on March 11th, I had my initial meeting with Nathan Bracken and let's see, and at March 12th, thank you to the Mark and other folks at the city. I went to the reception for the new statue of Bob the Bighorn, the sculpture. And full disclosure, I do work for the artist Serena Suplee, but he's an adorable bighorn, so I suggest you go sit there and you're encouraged to give him a hug. I don't know if he's still wearing his paisley tie. And then I did attend that EMS meeting, but now thankfully Jason is our official city rep to EMS, and I'm going through the stages of reapplying to the board as a community member. So there was all kinds of hazing. I'm joking, but and I did get my first tour of the new EMS building, and I think there will be official tours for the public in May. So I strongly advise people do that. I did listen in on the Moab Area Watershed Partnership, the MOP meeting on March 16th, and Luke's our rep there, so he can report on that. March 16th, I also had a system of care, Grand County, San Juan Advisory Board. I think I'm getting that acronym wrong. Oh, well, anyway, to give you some idea, system of care meeting. And we did have a meeting on Zoom between the city and Grand County and San Juan County. Just an initial meeting. Let's see, Kevin Walker was there from the county commission, Mallory, the administrator, the mayor, myself, Mac McDonald from San Juan County, and shoot, I'm forgetting someone. But anyway,
Carly.
What's that?
Carly.
Okay, yeah, so to discuss how to initially collaborate and coordinate more. So there are going to be, what did we decide on, monthly meetings or quarterly
Yeah,
meetings?
monthly meetings, the third Monday at 3 o'clock.
Okay, and so there is possibility for a council member to partake in that. So let the mayor know if you're interested. And let's see, I had my monthly meeting with the mayor and Luke. I did miss a GWISA meeting because of a family issue, but they told me it wasn't really important if I showed up. So the beauty of having a large quorum. We had our March 18th and 19th city strategic planning sessions. I did go up to Arches Drive to meet with a resident, and we got that good news today about money for the Umter project. So that's very exciting. And I'm sure after our next quarterly meeting, we could report to you guys about how we're going to use the money. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ronnie. Tawny.
Too late, and I don't remember.
Healthcare Special Service District.
Yeah, we had a healthcare special service district meeting and got a new board member. And I don't think I told you, Joette, it was sort of a fiasco at Wells Fargo.
Oh, to get it be a check signer.
Well, they still had Tom Lacey listed as the owner of that particular account. So we have to do some gyration to get it fixed.
Right.
And I went to a housing authority meeting last Thursday. And every other meeting that you guys went to too. So
Luke.
Yeah, so I attended my first LHCC meeting where they went over some of their point in time data that was kind of aggregated by a couple of the local organizations that are showing that there's 177 near or actually homeless people in Grant County, with 64 of them being literally homeless and 91 at risk of homelessness. There's potentially some overlap in those numbers using kind of some HIMIS data. I think they said there was 41 or 42 unique individuals for sure, but I know, for example, Seahaven will not disclose what people they count in that. So just due to confidentiality concerns, we got a presentation of the new housing-oriented website that was created by Katie Meinhardt at the Housing Authority, which is moabhousing.com. It's a really great resource, has a lot of really pertinent information on there. It discusses barriers to housing, compiles lists of rentals from like apartment complexes and property management companies. It has the What's for Rent Wednesday updated every week, and also includes a section for housing emergency resources. We got an update from the Moab Area Housing Task Force that they are currently working on updating the Moab Area Affordable Housing Plan, which was last updated in 2016, 2017. And they're hoping to publish that sometime this summer. There's definitely some people in the group who had expressed concerns about what direction that Walnut Lane will be taking. We had somebody inform us that from the last displacement, that was only 9 trailers several months ago, that we still have people who are homeless from that situation. Got an update from Moab Solutions at the Moab Free Health Clinic that they might begin doing street visits to kind of provide some basic medical services to our homeless population. USARA will be having an open house. I didn't catch a date for that, but I think that's coming up soon. Moab Free Health Clinic will also be offering dental services soon, which is something they haven't done previously, but it's desperately needed. There is already a wait list, so if you are interested in that, I'd recommend trying to get on that list as soon as possible. And then just a reminder that it is Multicultural March for the Multicultural Center. They're currently doing a fundraising campaign to kind of help try to provide a lot of the services that are targeted towards people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. I already kind of went over what we had discussed in the Planning Commission. And then at the Moab Area Watershed Partnership, they've developed a watershed management plan summary, which kind of attempts to summarize the history of the studies looking at groundwater in the Spanish Valley watershed, and have been able to kind of condense that down to a 7-page document, which is pretty impressive. We were also informed that USU will be having a scientist, I believe his name is Tom Lockmar, who will be doing his own independent review of all of the studies done about water availability within the area. And he's hoping to get that review completed within the next couple of months. And once that's completed, he'll try to put together a publicly accessible summary or fact sheet that is kind of digestible to the layperson. And then in terms of the Skakel Springs that Ronnie had alluded to, I believe that, yeah, so from UDWRI, they said that it'd be useful for the city to have a metering out there if it wanted to enforce water rights upstream, if they notice a reduction in spring water. With the letter that they said, they are hoping that it will potentially be at zero cost to the city if we are able to get a quote by it, but they're not 100% sure that all of those costs will be covered when they turn to the state for assistance with that. There's a report on green infrastructure and water-wise landscaping at city-owned locations presented by Mila. Also learned that Grant County will be hosting a small-scale agricultural workshop on March 31st at OSTA from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It is free to the public, but they are requesting RSVPs as lunch is being provided. And then I was also made aware of the fact that the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, can help with funds for some like farming related equipment. You need to be a registered farmer, but I guess you don't need to actually sell any produce. You just need to produce produce. So if anybody's looking at kind of like growing produce for themselves, there might be some assistance with equipment through that. And then kind of the other thing, we had a board member from the Grant County School District, or Ronnie and I had a board member from the Grant County School District reach out to us to just kind of make us aware that as far as they can tell, there are 41 Grant County School District students who are currently located at Walnut Lane. So just something else to take into consideration. But I think that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Luke. For me, met with the sheriff and the county attorney and the prosecuting attorney and with staff and with Chris Baird to talk about contracting for the fact that we're short-staffed and we need some support from the sheriff's office. So that was a really good discussion. It'll be ongoing. We'll be meeting with them again next Monday to further that conversation. We met with the joint city and county meeting, and Kaylin, you were wrong. You did meet, you were in that meeting, which was very productive. We covered a lot of items. We've got to continue to discuss things that will go on into the future, like CIB prioritization, so that the county and the city aren't going in with applications to CIB at the same time. Federal earmarks, we want to coordinate on that. Pickleball courts, how that's going to be funded. We talked about the tax assessment issue that Ben brought up during our strategic plan, and communication and messaging, and how we can coordinate to make sure that we're on the same page on issues that come up that impact both the city and the county, so that our messaging is the same. So very productive meeting. We'll be meeting again in April, and those will be ongoing monthly. This Friday, I meet with regional mayors. It's our first regional mayor meeting, and that will be with the town of Bluff, the town of Blanding, the town of Monticello, the town of Moab, and I'm going to reach out to Jasmine from Castle Valley because she should be a part of that conversation as well. And then I meet with Jen Sadoff tomorrow to talk about healthcare housing at on the district's healthcare special service district property. And so that also will be an ongoing discussion to start planning for that. And that's all I have. Anything else from anybody else?
Can I just add, Luke mentioned the USARA open house, and I do have the date for that if anyone wants to attend. And just to remind people, USARA stands for Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness, and they have offices on 100 West, so 23 South, 100 West, and that will be from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on April 1st.
Is that in Salt Lake?
No, that's in Moab.
Oh, okay. I thought you said 2300 South. It's like, do we have it? Oh,
no, 23 South, 100 West.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. Anything else from anybody else? Motion to adjourn. We made it to 9:30. That seems to be the going time. I always hope that we get done early, but I think it's going to be 9:30, you guys. So that's our schedule. We'll see you guys soon. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.